Police have launched a murder investigation this afternoon after the body of a popular local DJ was discovered in a secluded country lane.
It was obviously a really ferocious attack.
11 slash wounds and 10 stab wounds to different parts of his body.
A grieving community hunt for those responsible when a vulnerable adult is viciously killed.
You know, most people sort of couldn't believe it.
I never thought that anything like that would happen around these parts.
My suspicions were that there was something more to this, something related to drugs or some other kind of criminal fallout.
He couldn't see the bad in people. That's the problem with Michael. He thinks everybody's like him.
Perched on top of the White Cliffs of Dover lies the picturesque village of Capel-le-Ferne.
Capel is a really idyllic, friendly neighbourhood. It's the kind of place where you can leave your door open. It's a really safe place to live. The most exciting thing that happens here is the chickens escaping.
It's just a lovely village. Just countryside, you know, go out with the dogs and people say hello.
There's a pub, community centre, a caravan park. It's popular with dog walkers and holiday makers walking across the White Cliffs.
Everyone, knows each other, more elderly people than young. There's not really any crime.
10 minutes along the coast lies Aycliffe, a small hamlet next to the port of Dover, where the Kerr family, along with 30-year-old aspiring DJ Michael, call home.
Michael was butter wouldn't melt in his mouth sort of person. He would be very jovial, very jokey. I always knew him growing up. We all played together. Always a funny little guy. If he'd done anything wrong, if he misbehaved, he just gave you his smile and that was it.
Michael always managed to make his family laugh, not least his mother, Patricia.
He was mischievous, funny, just a normal child. He would be naughty and you'd try and tell him off, but he'd have this cheeky grin.
But Michael almost never made it into the world.
When Michael was born, his birth was very quick. And then a few hours later, the doctor came round and he said, your baby's a very poorly boy. There's only a 30% chance that he will survive the night.
Whilst Michael did make it through the night, doctors diagnosed him with Fragile X syndrome.
Michael was diagnosed when he was 6 with Fragile X syndrome. When he was 9, the doctors at Guy's Hospital dismissed Fragile X chromosome syndrome. So we've never known what was wrong with him. I'm convinced that it was cerebral palsy. I'm convinced of it.
His brain would function just as normal, but his body was just that much slower. But to us, he was Michael. He didn't have a condition. He was just Michael.
It never held him back. The doctors told me he would never walk. And just after his 3rd birthday, he ran across the room. Then they said he'd never ride a bike. So I go out and buy him a bike. And I can't remember how old he was when he started riding his bike, but there was no looking back once he got on that bike.
As Michael grew older, he developed a passion for music and parties and became a DJ in local pubs and clubs.
As we were growing up, sort of going to parties and discos and things like that, Michael would always sort of he would like to be the music man. He was the DJ.
As long as Michael loved it, he would play it. Anything and everything his mixes would be. And it would be like maybe Celine Dion going into Erasure, going into something else. And that's just how he was. But he loved it, and you could see he loved it. And that's what was lovely about Michael.
Whilst Michael loved being on the decks, his true passion was being behind the wheel.
As he started to get a bit older, he went towards his car. He'd done his driving lessons. Took him quite a while, bless him, but he passed, you know, he'd done it, he passed.
And the day he passed, you think he'd won the lottery. Absolutely would think he'd won the lottery. He was so made up that he'd passed.
The car that Michael had was like a goldy coloured Renault Clio, and it was his pride and joy. He loved it. I think he probably loved that car more than he did himself.
Michael was always keen to show off his pride and joy and was known for giving locals a lift home from Dover when the pubs closed.
When Michael passed his test, he just didn't drink, so he was always about, if he'd be outside, if a club finished, he'd be outside of his car. It just led on from there. Anyone want to lift home? He always wanted to make sure that, especially girls, if there's any girls, that they got home okay, because getting a taxi late at night in Dover could become impossible. He never done it for any financial gains. He never done it for anything. It would put petrol in the car and it meant he could be driving still. So he loved and lived for driving.
And I think that's where Michael's popularity came from, I think. Meeting people, you know, new friends, he would offer them lifts home, just literally out of the kindness of his heart. He would always make sure that people were safe because of his niceness and how he was with people, really.
But in the spring of 2013, everything changed.
Kent police have launched a murder probe after a body was discovered in the village of Capel-le-Fern. Police say the body of a 30-year-old man was discovered on a secluded country lane at around 1 p.m. this afternoon.
So when the police officers turned up, they saw immediately at the end of the lane, they could see Michael lying motionless a few metres away from his car. So this is the location where Michael Kerr was found. When I arrived here, Michael was lying here, face up, and then just over here was a significant pooling of blood. It was clear that it was a homicide investigation. He had significant injuries to his neck, and which he couldn't have done himself. His neck was open, and it also looked as if he'd been potentially moved or dragged. There was blood splatter within the car as well. And we discovered 2 of his teeth under his body. It was obviously a really ferocious attack.
But what had led to this popular DJ being murdered in such a brutal way? Had he picked up the wrong person? Could this have been a robbery that had gone tragically wrong? Or did Michael unwittingly stumble upon people up to no good?
My suspicions were that there was something more to this.
Locals in the coastal village of Capel-le-Fern are waking up to news of a brutal murder.
The body of 30-year-old DJ Michael Kerr was found on Satmar Lane earlier this afternoon. Kent police are appealing for any information into the attack.
I did wake up with this sick feeling in my stomach on the 10th. I've got this nervous feeling that something's going to happen. And then there was a knock at my door. And I remember seeing this woman standing there, and she asked if I was Michael's mum. And I said, yeah, what's he done? And then she just said, I'm sorry.
We was actually, as a family, we're down at the little holiday village about half-hour away. And Michael was supposed to come down and join us that day. My phone lit up with hundreds of missed phone calls and messages from my friend, who then informed me that Michael had died. She then went on to tell me that he'd been attacked and believed that he'd been stabbed.
Obviously, at first, I didn't want to believe it was Michael. I kept saying to myself, no, it can't be Michael. It can't be. It's not going to be Michael. Why would anybody do this to Michael? He's everybody's friend. Everybody loves Michael. It can't be him. Can't be him. And then as the evening went on, it came out that it was Michael, and yeah, that's how I found out.
News of this horrific attack soon spreads across the quiet coastal village.
I woke up and there were police everywhere. I felt sick, I felt disgusted, and I couldn't understand why someone would do what they did.
You know, most people sort of couldn't believe it. A lot of the older people were a little bit unsettled. You know, anyone that lived near something like that would be.
It was a shock to the system. You know, I mean, you don't expect anything like that here. It's such a quiet place.
Kent police work immediately to preserve the crime scene.
We cordoned off the scene. We had the car that needed to be examined. And then, because of the seriousness of the case, we actually organised for a pathologist to come to the scene and do an assessment of the scene and take samples of the scene. That's really unusual. That very rarely happens, only on the most serious of cases. But actually, he couldn't arrive until the next day. And the weather was awful that night. We had wind and we had rain, and this is on top of the cliffs, so it's really open. We had a tent that was set up, and the officer did a fantastic job protecting him before taking Michael to the mortuary.
We went to see him, and he was covered up with this purple tape. And I remember saying to him, "You've got Mummy's favourite colour wrapped round you." And I remember laying over him, and I felt him move. And in that second, I just thought, it's not real, it's going to be fine, it's going to wake up.
The crime scene is contained, and the search for anything which points to Michael's murderer begins.
What was obvious from the initial search is that his mobile phone was missing and not found. His wallet was intact though, so there was no obvious sort of sign that it might be a robbery.
With the robbery ruled out, detectives speculate whether Michael's phone holds vital information about his attacker.
My suspicions were that there was something more to this. I was really suspicious. I didn't know whether it was a fallout over drugs and drug dealing. So when we first turned up, the car was actually wedged up against the bank as if it had been driven up the bank, which went with something obviously bad going on, whether it's somebody trying to get away or something.
The evidence points towards the driver trying to take Michael's car to make a hasty escape. The question is, what was Michael doing in such a secluded location?
There was no relatives or no friends of Michael's to be lived anywhere near that area. There was no family he would have been seeing. No reason that Michael would have been there. It was just there because he was lured there.
With little reason for Michael to be at Satmar Lane, suspicions grow within the local community.
So Dover is obviously a major travel hub. It has the port, it's a major thoroughfare across the channel. And Aycliffe is to the west of the town and is very close to a lorry park. A lot of transient people coming and going, lorry drivers, travellers, tourists. So the idea that Michael Kerr could have been killed by someone just passing through was quite suggestible.
Detectives need to keep an open mind. They reach out to the people that knew Michael well to help build a profile of his movements that could lead to the attacker.
Michael Kerr is a 30-year-old guy. He's got a learning disability. He was actually well known locally. Quite often he'd be seen driving around with friends, giving people lifts home from nightclubs. He was, a genuinely overtly helpful guy, trusting, potentially too trusting.
Yeah, I think he did want to be everybody's mate. And a lot of people took advantage of that. Some people not in necessarily a good way. And if it meant making friends, then he was vulnerable. And he'd give people his money and give them lifts everywhere.
Which is what he always done nearly every day since he had the car, to help people out. And he wouldn't not help people out.
He couldn't see the bad in people. That's the problem with Michael. He can't see the bad in people. He thinks everybody's like him.
the murder happening at night in such a rural area, the investigation turns to the local community. Could there be witnesses to Michael's death?
We went door to door to see whether anyone had heard anything that happened at that time of night, because it's so rural, then maybe they would have heard. And actually there was somebody at a premises about 100 metres away who did say to us that they heard some sort of shouts and screaming, but it sounded more sort of laughing and screaming and people messing around more than anything else, and that was it.
With the latest information from family and locals, detectives begin to wonder. Had Michael naively offered a lift to his killer? Was it a friend or a stranger? As the post-mortem begins, it's apparent whoever it was carried out an horrific attack.
Mr. Kerr's injuries are almost all sharp force injuries. So we're talking about a bladed article. The most obvious injuries that Mr. Kerr sustained were 21 sharp force injuries, 11 slash wounds where the knife had been drawn across the skin, and 10 stab wounds to different parts of his body where the knife had been stabbed in. He also had a couple of teeth knocked out. There was a distinct lack of defensive injuries on Mr. Kerr. That would suggest that he was overcome very suddenly, overpowered very quickly, and potentially started to lose blood and lose consciousness so quickly that he simply didn't have the opportunity to respond.
From the evidence from the pathologist, it's clear that this was a very, very sustained attack. So it wasn't a matter of seconds. This would have taken minutes to carry out.
The immediate thing that springs to mind with that number of injuries is it is more than you need to kill somebody. So this is into what some of the psychologists would call overkill. This is not just ending someone's life. This is far in excess of what's necessary to do that.
With the cause of death established, the race is on to find the murder weapon before vital evidence that would point towards the killer could be lost.
From the scene here, it's a narrow single-track lane that runs for about a mile or so up to the A20. So we had dozens of officers searching, 20 or 30 metres either side, all the way along, which took a number of days. So there's also a pond which we had officers forensically searching throughout.
The police and divers and that, they was all over here, going under the water, dredging it. I mean, they was in there days, just trying to find anything.
Having combed the hedgerows and surrounding fields, police finally uncover a potential lead.
Michael's mobile phone was missing, but we found on the search of the lane, his phone was smashed. It looked like it had been thrown on the floor and stamped on, and then kicked into the hedge.
With the phone sent for data analysis, their next priority is to find the murder weapon.
We didn't find anything in the ponds, but it's when we got onto the main road, I made the decision to search all of the storm drains. On the main road, there are 200 drains, and we got help from the local authority to suck out the stuff in the drains, and we found 2 knives.
With multiple knives discovered, police have to consider the possibility there could be more than one killer. Had Michael been subjected to a group attack? And if so, what was the motive? But as police start to consider that theory, there's a breakthrough.
Detectives investigating the murder of local DJ Michael Kerr have made a number of arrests in Dover today. 5 people were taken into custody and detained for questioning in what has become a major investigation.
A police officer actually had a telephone call from somebody to say something like, you need to come and speak to them. And then police turned up at the address.
5 people are arrested at the house in Dover. All suspects are believed to be locals in their 20s.
All the suspects were known to each other. They were living together in the same house. They were all arrested on suspicion of the murder of Michael Kerr. It would have been a shock to the local community. A lot of questions. Who are they? And are they a danger to other people in the communities?
In the small village of Capel-le-Ferne on the Kent coast, police are investigating the murder of Michael Kerr and have arrested a group of people all living in the same house.
It would have been a shock to the local community. A lot of questions to be answered. Who are they? How could they have done this? What was the reason behind it? And are they a danger to other people in the communities?
While the police question the group of suspects, Michael's community rally together to celebrate his life and memory.
The whole community, I think, was just in shock as to why anybody would want to hurt Michael. The way the community got together, just for the remembrance of Michael, really, a few days after was astonishing. It was something you'd see of a movie or something, you know. It's like literally the whole of Dover came together for Michael, basically, literally just for Michael.
All of a sudden, there's just what felt like thousands of Chinese lanterns went up from the seafront. It was an amazing sight. You know, and I remember standing there. God, all that for my boy. Who knew?
Despite the beautiful send-off for Michael, the interrogation of the 5 suspects in connection with his death continues.
The guys were well known to the police for varying different things. I was really suspicious that there was something going on.
All 5 suspects are questioned by the police. Then there's shocking news. 3 of the 5 suspects are released, but the 2 that remain in custody are women. One of them is 22-year-old Alicia Davis.
We're presented with these 2 young ladies who've got no criminal records previously. Alicia Davis was an air cadet. You know, comes from I'll argue a reasonable background.
Also in custody is 21-year-old Charlotte Coulson. The pair met each other through the local nightlife scene in Dover and have been living together for nearly 6 months.
Charlotte Coulson was very good friends with Alicia Davis, and the pair of them were both very heavy drinkers and were well known in the area.
These girls are living a bit of a party lifestyle. They're constantly looking for drink, constantly looking for opportunity to have fun.
But what detectives need to know is how the women knew Michael, and were they involved in his death?
Charlotte Coulson said that she met Michael a year or so before in the clubbing scene within Dover. He'd be around. He was known as a gentle guy that was probably trying to sort of, find a girlfriend, trying to befriend people. She'd had lifts from him before. She'd had lifts back from nightclubs, also occasionally to take her to a supermarket, that sort of thing. And it was actually only over recent weeks that Alicia got introduced to him.
I've seen Michael a couple of times with them in the car, and occasion a week before, I've seen Michael with one of them in the car get out of his car and go into the shop and buy some alcohol.
As the police interview both women under caution, there's a revelation when they both admit to meeting Michael twice on the day he died.
They gave pretty consistent accounts in interviews. They've then described what has then happened.
They both describe that at 8 o'clock in the evening, Michael picks up Alicia Davis and takes her to Satmar Lane in Capel-le-Ferne. Here they park up for some time before Michael then drives her back to Dover, buying her alcohol before dropping her home. The women spend the evening drinking, but just after midnight, Michael returns to their house.
Michael Kerr picked them up and they went for a drive to Satmar Lane.
Michael parks in the same spot he and Alicia Davis were at earlier in the evening.
Charlotte was in the back. Michael and Alicia were in the front.
What Alicia Davis says next turns the investigation on its head.
What Alicia Davis was saying is that she was attacked and raped by Michael. And she then defended herself. She put her hands down the side of the seat and found a knife and went to the only area of flesh that she could see, which is the throat, where she stabbed him.
With Davis claiming she attacked to defend herself, Charlotte's account is crucial.
She said she was asleep in the back of the car and she woke up to a commotion where Alicia was actually attacking him.
According to Coulson, she'd been asleep in the back and couldn't do anything about it, couldn't stop it after it had begun, and was trapped in the back seat and couldn't get out of the car either.
Charlotte Coulson then gave a very confused description about how they both got out of the car, and they then moved Michael's body, tried to drive off. So that explains the position of the car. When we found it, she said they stalled it and couldn't get it working, which is why they then decided to walk back to Dover.
With Davis claiming she stabbed Michael in self-defence, and Coulson adamant she was not involved, simply a bystander at the scene, the police need to examine the evidence to establish if their defences could in fact be the truth.
There was quite a lot of work for us to do, and certainly not make any presumptions, because for two young ladies not known to police before, no evidence of violence, to go from nothing to not just harming, killing somebody, but ferocious attack, that just did not make sense.
In their search for the truth, police obtained CCTV evidence from the local area.
I let them know that I had CCTV and people were on CCTV.
It was actually a premises close by that we got CCTV from that showed the vehicle going past, which enabled us to time when they turned up at the scene. We also were able to get some information from telephone analysis of movements of phones, so it all tied up to the early hours of the 10th of April.
By comparing CCTV and telephone mass data, detectives are able to confirm Michael's car arrived in Capel-le-Ferne shortly after 2 a.m. But when they examine both suspects' phones, they uncover some crucial information that throws the girls' version of events into serious question.
We used some techniques to recover some deleted messages, some messages that we know that were definitely deleted, that timed at exactly the time that the CCTV showed that the car arrived. And there's an exchange between Coulson and Davis by text message, whilst clearly Michael is driving to the end, basically saying, "Go now. Now do it now." And Davis responding to Coulson to say, "No, I can't. You're going to have to start." And then a message back saying, "Right, let's do it. Let's go." And then a text message saying, "Let's party." And this is within 3 minutes of passing the CCTV and being in that area. So that in itself is then indicating that that they planned it. And both girls are involved in it, which goes against Coulson, who's then trying to say, "Well, I was asleep in the back. You know, my mate did it."
Police believe the text messages prove Michael's death wasn't in self-defense, but a well-planned attack. And the two knives discovered on the route the girls would have walked home raises even more doubt.
Their defence was that he had raped Alicia Davis and that she happened to discover a knife. Taking that with the knives that we recovered from the drain, when we compared the knives to knives in the premises in Dover, there were 2 knife sets, and these knives were the ones that were missing from the knife sets. So the girls took the knives with them. This isn't I found a knife and I'm protecting myself because he's raping me. They've planned to murder him.
A further search of the women's house uncovers more evidence.
We later discover that there's a fire in the back garden. And we find what looks like clothing that's been set alight. The others in the premises say that when they came home, they started putting clothes in the washing machine, but it was the burnt clothing that we were then able to match to them wearing before the event. The act of burning the clothes, was sufficient for us to get a charge.
With all the evidence pointing away from the claim of self-defence, Alicia Davis and Charlotte Coulson are charged with Michael Kerr's murder.
I think a lot of people were shocked. 2 young females. Anyone in their right mind would be, sort of amazed that they could do something.
A 21-year-old and a 22-year-old with no previous convictions or knowledge to police. Why did they kill Michael?
"22-year-old Alicia Davis and 21-year-old Charlotte Coulson have been charged with the murder of aspiring DJ Michael Kerr. But the question on everyone's lips is, why would 2 girls with no criminal backgrounds kill a man in such a brutal way?
Today, the trial of 2 young women is set to begin in central London for the murder of a 30-year-old man in the village of Capel-le-Ferne, Dover.
With both girls pleading not guilty, the horrific details of Michael's death are to be laid bare in court.
The trial was actually moved out of Kent. There was a decision made because of the local interest and the seriousness of the case that it was allocated to the Old Bailey.
In December 2013, the trial into Michael's murder begins in central London, and his family come face to face with his alleged killers.
They both were brought in, sat in their separate spaces in the court, heads down, didn't look up, didn't acknowledge anybody, just kept their heads down.
They would be sat there laughing and joking, but as soon as the judge and jury came in, they would sit there with their heads down, behave themselves. And I didn't know I was capable of hating somebody as much as I hate those. They showed no remorse, nothing, absolutely nothing.
As the trial begins, both Davis and Coulson plead that they acted in self-defence.
The accusations they made against Michael just showed how evil they were. They planned this, they done it, they took his life and they tried to get away with it by making up the most horrendous, hideous lie about Michael.
I know that he wouldn't have done anything wrong to them. There was allegations made against Michael which were complete and shot down, utter nonsense. So no, I don't know or can think of any reason why they would have wanted to do it. Just out of pure evil, I suppose.
No matter how much they prepared us for it, when you hear what they're saying in their interviews in that courtroom, and you hear the accusations about my son, nothing prepares you for that.
Key to the prosecution's case is establishing that Alicia Davis's version of events were not true.
It was alleged that Michael Kerr had tried to rape Alicia in the car. So Alicia had acted in self-defence by stabbing him multiple times.
To disprove Alicia's defence, we actually took the gold Clio to the Old Bailey, parked it in the rear yard, and the judge and the jury all came out to inspect it. We thought that was really important because when she describes what happened with him effectively undressing and then undressing her, in the act of rape, you only have to look at the car and the size of the car on the inside to say that couldn't possibly happen. You know, even 3 people in it would have been quite tight.
New evidence revealed in court further questions their defence.
Another thing that we discovered later is that there were actually text messages on Charlotte Coulson's phone to Michael after he was dead to say, why haven't you come to pick us up? Why we haven't heard from you? Clearly trying to misdirect the police investigation to say, well, we never saw him.
She tried to establish a false alibi, which is quite a cynical move after the murder, to try and make it seem as if she thought that he was still alive.
As the trial progresses, further information as to why the defendants met with Michael that day comes to light.
Alicia Davis actually admitted earlier that she had had sex with Michael for money. Charlotte Coulson said she's the one that actually had organised for Alicia to have sex with him for money. They needed £20 to pay for alcohol.
Charlotte Coulson virtually pimped out her friend, Alicia, to go and have sex with Michael. It doesn't seem like an awful lot of money, essentially beer money for them, but it seems that Alicia agreed to that.
Finally, the court is presented with a possible motive for the brutal killing.
On the face of it, the girls are worried that they've prostituted Alicia to get money for alcohol, and that Michael, as a vulnerable adult, now thinks that he's got a girlfriend in a relationship. So is the only motivation then to stop that happening? Instead of saying, no, that's not what it is, Michael, to actually lure him in and kill him.
They egged each other on. They drank very, very heavily. And from there, they decide to perhaps teach him a lesson, to punish him.
Still, Coulson maintains she wasn't involved in the vicious attack and that Alicia Davis acted alone. But having discovered 2 knives, the court hears damning evidence which suggests a different story.
With stab wounds, like with any other sort of wound, you're looking at where they are, how deep they are, what angle they're going in at. The injuries were widely distributed on Mr. Kerr's body, so they're not all focused in one place. If they're all over his body, if the injuries are slightly different in different places, it's suggesting more than one assailant.
The judge's view later was that Charlotte Coulson was just as involved, and actually probably, because of the position of the wounds on the neck, that they were from behind. That Charlotte pulled his hair, pulled his chin back, and slashed his throat a number of times. And the injuries are horrific. The stab to the chest by Alicia that she's admitted, there's evidence that she took the knife partially out of his chest and moved the position of it to make sure that she hit his heart. I mean, that comes across with such callousness. The extreme of violence from where you wouldn't expect it is just incredible.
After murdering Michael in cold blood, the court hears how Davis and Coulson went on to enjoy the rest of their night.
Police found CCTV evidence from after the murder, which showed they'd gone to McDonald's and bought booze, which perhaps suggested that they'd taken money from Michael after they'd killed him as well. And we know also people witnessed hearing the girls laughing and joking as they returned back to their home. So it just shows the callousness that they regarded what they'd done.
I've dealt with many, many murders over the years, and this is up there. You know, for girls with nothing in their background that indicates that they would go down a path of criminality, it just does not make sense.
They were both very heavy drinkers. They had a bit of a toxic friendship. And I think it would be too simple an explanation to say they did it for a couple of pounds for the price of a McDonald's. But together, they proved to be an absolutely deadly combination.
After a grueling 3-week trial, the jury returns its verdict. Both Alicia Davis and Charlotte Coulson are found guilty of murder. Davis is sentenced to life, with a minimum of 25 years. Coulson is sentenced to life, and a minimum of 20 years.
It is closure in a way. It's closure that Michael's got his justice, but it still will never be enough in my eyes. It will never be enough.
They both should have got longer. I don't know much about prison, only what I've seen on television. But I really hope they're not having an easy time. I hope they're not having an easy time.
I don't think people can change. If there's evil in those people like that, there wasn't just one attack, there was 2 people doing a vicious attack on him. So they should pay for it with their lives.
So many people have said, a life for a life. I don't want that. You know, I don't want them to die. Because in my head, every night when those lights are out, they see and they hear and they are haunted by what they've done to my boy. And it torments them.
Eight years after Michael's passing, his friends and family are slowly coming to terms with life without him.
The fact is now we can smile and laugh and remember Mike for who he was and what he meant to us, rather than the way that he was taken. Just the biggest smile, absolutely loving life. Love him to bits and miss him completely.
I think what happened to Michael shook the whole community. And I don't think Michael realised how loved he was.
Life stops for you. The world still revolves for everybody else. But it doesn't revolve for you. But I was told once that I've got to let him go. I've got to let go of the anger. I've got to let go of the pain. I've got to let him go. I can't. I don't want the pain to go because I'm scared that if the pain goes, he goes. And all while I've got the pain, I've got him. I don't know if that's normal, but that's how I feel.
And there's more shocking true stories weeknights at 11 as we follow a different case a day in More Killer in My Village.
There was a 999 call received from dog walkers that had found a suitcase on a lay-by just near the road.
People came across the suitcase and opened it, and inside was the remains of a person.
Local people found it extraordinary that such an incident could happen here.
For a murder to happen, not only a murder, but a murder on this scale, it was absolutely shocking for the community.
We had knowledge that he had over £270,000 worth of debt, and he was struggling to pay off those debts.
There was blood absolutely everywhere in that room, on the sofa, on the walls and on the ceiling.
Through extreme measures, he used the alternative of planning the murder of his friend.
Tintwistle is an idyllic village nestled on the edge of the Peak District.
Tintwistle is a typical Peak District village. It's got a mixture of beautiful stone cottages. It's on the banks of the Longdendale Valley, and behind it are the Tintwistle Moors, known as the Nar and the Lower Moor. And it has stunning views over the Longdendale Valley and the 5 reservoirs.
A very parochial village where people can leave your back door open, no problems.
In Tintwistle, everyone knows each other. It's a very, neighbourly feel. It's a very close-knit community.
We've got a lot of people who have a lot of very good neighbours, and I think everybody supports each other.
In terms of crime rates in Tintwistle, it's fairly, non-existent.
But all this is about to change when the peace is shattered early one morning.
On the 10th of October, there was a 999 call received from dog walkers that had found a suitcase on a lay-by just near the road.
The location was on a main road that went between Manchester and Sheffield, and it dipped down a little bit into Derbyshire. It was a car park off the main road, but it was an area that was quite popular for walkers.
As you come into Tintwistle from the east, you go along what's called the Woodhead Pass, and this particular suitcase was dumped just over the wall as you go into the village beside the first reservoir.
As I remember, like this people passing by this lay-by and came across a suitcase and opened it, and inside the suitcase was the remains of a person.
Police are immediately dispatched to the area.
There's quite a long drive, really, from the point where I got the call to the point where I arrived at the scene. Just to give you some idea around the geography, when I first got the call, I was in Derby, which is here. The deposition site was all the way to the north of the county, to the north of Derbyshire, and as you can see, it's right at the very tip of the county.
Upon arrival, they are met with a gruesome sight.
It looks like the suitcase has been set on fire, and inside that suitcase we have a body of a man whose head has been removed, whose arms have been removed, and whose feet have been removed.
It was a Samsonite suitcase that was in an extremely charred state. But then it became apparent, and we had a human torso that had been extremely cruelly dismembered and burnt.
As a crime, this is really, really vicious. For somebody to remove all the limbs of a body, never mind commit the murder itself.
Derbyshire Constabulary launch a murder investigation, and news of the horrific find soon spreads around the village.
Oh, like chicken pox. Everybody talks about it, we all know about it. You go in the local shops. Have you heard?
In Tintwistle, it's a really neighbourly community. Everyone knows each other. If there's gossip, someone down the road will know about it in 10 minutes or so. Considering the crime rate was fairly non-existent, for a murder to happen, not only a murder, but a murder on this scale, it was completely shocking for the community.
I think local people found it extraordinary that such an incident could happen here. I think, like all major crimes that happen in what everybody would regard as somewhere quiet and peace-loving, it adds to people's fear that something else could happen, or something else could happen as a result of it.
Police immediately cordon off the crime scene.
The big issue you've got here is you're out in the open. So there's two things. There's the weather, so rain can come and wash away your evidence. But secondly, you've got the issue of privacy. This is a really busy road, there's lots of traffic coming through, and you need to protect the privacy of that individual. That's really important.
Really what you want to do is secure and preserve as much evidence as you can. So there would have been things like identifying where the scene is, making sure that it was cordoned off, that there was enough police officers to ensure that nobody stumbled across the scene.
Beyond the scene, you might be looking at further searches. Has anything discarded, any clothing, any weapons, etc. So this particular point is very important from a forensic point of view. So you would want to be able to get some of your experts down, you want your crime scene manager, you'd really want your pathologist to be coming down to having a look at the scene, just so they have a full understanding of what's here, so that they can do a better job down the line.
And what I would do there is I'd have a discussion with the crime scene manager about the best way of removing the body to a hospital, but also making sure that we didn't lose any evidence while we were in that process, because the evidence that you might lose might be the only evidence that you get that helps you with the case.
Once you start moving a body, then the issue there is a potential loss of evidence, so there'll be some sampling requirements there and then, even in the circumstances where a body's been burnt. For example, there may well be fibres that have been transferred from the offender to the body, or alternatively to the suitcase, that haven't been damaged. It's really important to pick those up at that point.
The body is removed, and police focus on one thing.
But I think when you look at the wider picture around this is somebody's life. This is that they've lost, and you know what I really want to do is find out who the family is, who are the relatives and the friends of this individual, and they need informing at the earliest opportunity.
This was going to be a huge challenge for the police now, because there's absolutely nothing to go by. They've just found a torso. There's nothing to identify the person, no fingerprints.
When you're looking at the difficulty presented by not being able to make an identification, the first things that we considered were things like the police database, and then we started looking at people who were missing, but because we had quite a wide geographical area, it was looking at people who were perhaps missing from West Yorkshire, South Yorkshire, Greater Manchester, as well as Derbyshire. But it's an arterial route, could have been from anywhere.
With very little to go on, the pressure is on for the police to try to identify the body.
You head towards the things that you are quite confident that will bring about an identification. But then when the obvious start to go, then it progressively becomes more and more difficult. And you start considering any other locations or any other information that you may get that you think will help you identify who this person was. So it made it a really difficult inquiry where we were having to be very, very precise around the investigative tactics that we used to try and find out who were the people who were involved.
Whilst the police await lab results from the pathologist's examination of the body, their attention turns to other lines of inquiry.
So the first point of call for the police now would have been to conduct local inquiries, asking people if they'd seen anything, if they'd heard anything.
When these things initially happen, all sorts of stories start to abound.
But the question on everybody's lips is, who is the victim?
Foremost in my mind was, there is a family somewhere whose loved one has been murdered, and they don't know about it.
In the picturesque Peak District, police have launched a murder investigation after an unidentified body was discovered in a suitcase which had been set alight.
So the condition of the body when we found it, the head had been removed, both hands had been removed, and the feet had been removed. There were two things that I sort of realised quite quickly. One, that was a deposition site. That wasn't where the murder had taken place. That was where the body had been placed afterwards. And the second thing was, and it was around whether the victim and the offender knew each other. And I took the view that why would one take the steps to hide somebody's identity if they didn't know each other? So I sort of realised in my own mind that if I worked out who the victim was, I would be able to work out who the offender was. And if I worked out who the offender was, I'd be able to work out who the victim was.
Unable to identify their victim, police await the results of the post-mortem.
Slightly unusually, there was no cause of death. So this tells us that there was no marks or scars or any wounds on the body parts that we had recovered, and clearly the victim's head had been removed. When we looked at the information that we did have from the post-mortem, this was a light-skinned male, and that's all that we were able really to glean from that. From the post-mortem, there were no marks, scars, tattoos or anything that would have assisted us making an identification.
Police trawl the missing persons database for any clues as to who their victim could be.
At the time, there was a lot of missing persons cases, so this could have been absolutely anybody.
There's quite a lot of missing people reported every single day in Derbyshire. And it was a case of refreshing those every single day, because the person may not be reported on day 1 or day 2 or day 3, but every single day going through the detail of who those individuals were and seeing if we could make a connection between the body that we got and that person who was missing.
With little to go on, Derbyshire Constabulary hold a press conference.
The purpose of today's press conference is to ask for the public's help to identify the victim. We are working with other forces to ascertain whether our victim may have been reported missing in a neighbouring county. But we recognise that he might not have been reported missing at all. We are therefore asking members of the public to come forward if they have not seen a neighbour or a friend or a colleague, or indeed any members of their family recently. A special call centre has been set up to take calls from across the UK, and we are urging people to provide information in relation to this murder investigation.
Information soon starts to filter into the police.
It became apparent that a number of dog walkers had seen the suitcase, but hadn't realised exactly what was inside.
So in order to better understand the time frame that we're looking at and understand when the body may have been put in the car park, we did substantial inquiries with people who'd been on the road. We were asking for people who'd got dash cam footage or people that had driven past. And there were a few positive responses out of that, which were able to tell us that the fire had been set late the night before.
With 3 different drivers claiming to have seen a fire around 11:30 p.m. on the 9th of October, officers on the ground can now focus on who was in the area around that time, in a bid to identify the potential killer.
So that was really useful from the initial investigation point of view to be able to really narrow those timelines so you could concentrate on that time period and work out from there what the offender had done, where he'd been, where he'd likely to travel to and from.
Police now ramp up their inquiries.
There was a bolt out of the blue, and we got we got a phone call in from South Yorkshire to inform us that there was actually an ANPR camera on the A628. So the phone call that we got on that day was, do you know you've got an ANPR camera on the 628? And no, we didn't, but thanks very much for telling us, that's really great.
Police immediately trawl through the automatic number plate recognition cameras to establish which vehicles had passed through the area on the night in question.
The police followed ANPR camera footage and located a Mercedes vehicle that triggered the camera just after 11 o'clock on Sunday the 9th, the evening before, and then didn't actually make it all the way across Woodhead Pass Road and to trigger the other ANPR camera at the other end.
It was the only vehicle that passed in the window of opportunity. So every other vehicle only went in one direction, either towards Manchester or towards Yorkshire.
All the vehicles, over 200 that had travelled along that road within the time period, down to one that had turned around and returned back to the Manchester area.
That was a strong indication that that vehicle was the one that deposited the body here on the night of the 9th.
After 10 days of round-the-clock investigations, and still having no clue as to the identity of their victim or suspect, this discovery is key.
The Mercedes triggered the camera on the evening before between 23:09 and 23:26. So straight away that was something I was very interested in, and we started to make some inquiries as to who might be the owner and what might be the significance of that vehicle.
This was absolutely key in the investigation. After 10 days of not finding anything, they needed to find out who this silver Mercedes belonged to.
As it happened, the vehicle didn't have any insurance, and so there was a reason to go and stop it and speak to the driver and have a look at the vehicle.
After further investigation, police discover that the vehicle is registered to someone living in Manchester.
So the owner of the vehicle was somebody called Ming Jiang.
Once the vehicle had been identified, it was registered to Ming Jiang, and therefore this triggered for the police to monitor him, make inquiries as to where he lived, inquiries of where he went.
There was so much pressure on the police. At this point in the investigation, it was very time sensitive. After 10 days, they really needed to find this person. At this point, the person who committed the crime could have run away, they could have covered up, or they could have very much so committed again.
Initial inquiries reveal Ming Jiang lives in Manchester, so Derbyshire Constabulary enlist the help of their colleagues over there.
When Greater Manchester Police assisted us, they were able to locate the vehicle, and because it was driven without any insurance, we were able to seize it. And when we seized the vehicle, we were then able to forensically examine it. And what I was looking for in that forensic examination was to find any evidence that might link to the body that we've got and the scene that we'd preserved some days before.
The police found a speck of blood in the rear that was the size of a 10p coin.
This was a really, really big moment in the investigation. What I would be looking to find out there is a blood spot in the boot of the vehicle the same as the blood that we found at the scene. So the DNA was sent away for comparison. It was the longest 24 hours I can imagine. Eventually it came back, and it came back with the news that we were really hoping for, and that was that the blood in the boot matched the DNA of the blood at the scene.
The blood match in the boot of the car puts Ming Jiang at the forefront of the investigation.
I felt this was the first time we were getting a breakthrough and first time we were getting an indication as to what may have taken place here. So as soon as we got the positive information about the DNA hit, it was a case of let's get this person arrested at the earliest opportunity.
So Ming Jiang was arrested on the 20th of October. They'd attended a casino in Manchester where they believed he was, and he was arrested at that location.
Now that the police have Ming Jiang in custody for questioning, time is of the essence to find evidence linking him to the murder.
What is also part of the inquiry is to start doing an evidential search around him to understand where he lived, what his movements were, and whether there was any other evidence that we'd be able to glean from his home address.
The police searched the home address and they found bloodstains all over the carpet. There was blood dispersion across all of the walls. They had been painted over and quite a shoddy clean-up had taken place. It was an extensive clean-up, but there was still blood throughout the flat and in the bathroom.
There was traces of blood absolutely everywhere that weren't immediately apparent to the eye. But there were things like the blood had seeped through the laminate flooring. There was blood that was soaked into the cushions on the sofa. There was blood on the walls and on the ceiling.
So the scene was a really rich source of evidence for us. The main evidence we got were 2 finger marks in blood. So we got one under a table, and the evidence you're really looking for there is the offender's fingerprint in the victim's blood. And getting that in 2 places was very, very critical evidence.
At this point, it's absolutely safe for the police to say that the murder took place in this apartment.
days into the investigation of the body in the suitcase found in a Derbyshire village, police have discovered a car linked to the murder and have made an arrest.
A forensics team investigated the car. They swabbed the blood. This matched the torso that was found in the suitcase. So at this point, the police were then able to arrest Mr. Ming Jiang.
Forensic tests reveal the blood on the torso in the suitcase is a match for the blood in Jiang's flat in Manchester, making Ming Jiang their #1 suspect.
So the investigation moved over to Manchester because it became clear from the Derbyshire point of view that the offence had actually taken place in Manchester. As a result of their inquiries, that took them to the flat at Falconwood Way in Beswick. And as a result of what they found there, they felt very strongly that that was actually the place of the murder. And so as a result of that, that would then become a Manchester investigation.
But police are no closer to identifying their victim.
So as the inquiry goes on, the stress and the pressure builds. As a senior investigating officer, it's a privilege to do that role. But you do take the responsibility of having to investigate the death of somebody, and you owe that responsibility to the family of the victim. So I was really concerned about finding out who that was and getting that information to them at the earliest opportunity.
However, searches of their suspect and his car have led to a discovery.
When we did the evidential search of the Mercedes vehicle, we found some banking documents of another person called Yang Lu.
He had certain possessions on his person. At the time, he had his passport, he had his bank cards.
And that led us to an address in Salford, at Media City. And there were some lines of inquiry that we needed to conduct at that address and find out what the relationship was with this person and how they fitted into the inquiry.
Police immediately sent officers to Yang Lu's address.
There was no answer, it was nowhere to be seen by anybody. So I made the decision that we were going to force entry into that apartment and find out really who this person was. So we forced entry into the address at Media City. Nothing particularly remarkable about the address, but what it did allow us to do was take some items from there which we knew the owner of that apartment would have left their DNA on. So very quickly we were able to send that away for analysis.
Finally, there is a breakthrough. Results come back matching Yang Lu's DNA to the torso, as well as the blood found in Ming Jiang's flat and car. Almost 2 weeks after the discovery, police have the name of their victim.
So what we did find out was that Yang Lu was a 27-year-old male, originally from China.
Yang Lu came to the UK in 2000 to study, where he went to the University of Leeds. His family actually worked really, really hard to save money so that he could study in the UK and achieve his goals and his dreams.
He finished his master's degree, and after that he stayed here and become a shares and stock trader.
He'd not brought any of his family with him over here, so if you look at the reasons why he may not have been reported missing, his family simply didn't know that he wasn't where he should have been.
Police now have the harrowing task of informing their victim's family.
This was a really difficult case from a family point of view. Under normal circumstances, we'd want to inform the family in person. And in the end, we actually had to make the call to the family in order to inform them. That's something that we wouldn't normally do under any circumstances, but unfortunately with the distance involved, we had no other option. I arranged for contact through Interpol with the Chinese authorities in order to let the family know. In the meantime, we allocated family liaison officers in order that we could make the process as smooth as possible.
Yang's family were absolutely devastated when they found out, their only son had been murdered. Not only murdered, but in such a vicious way.
And then they arrived in the UK in the second week of November.
Yang was very close to his family. They spoke on the phone near enough every single day. He actually vowed to go back to China and look after his family if one of them was to fall ill. And I think that just shows the tight-knit relationship they have, because he'd built himself this fantastic life in the UK and he was really willing to give that up to go back and look after his family.
When the family was here, then I helped them in different ways because they can't speak English. So most of the time that if they have something do not understand about the police procedure, and I help to explain them.
They were completely grief-stricken. They had lost their only son, who had come to the United Kingdom to study at university. He was a very clever young academic man and a very bright young man, and they were deprived of their son.
With time running out to hold their suspect in custody, police need to work fast to build enough evidence to charge him.
Ming Jiang is a danger to the public, and we would really want to be in a position where he'd be charged at that point. The secondary issue is he's a big flight risk. We'd be worried about him kind of moving back to China or elsewhere.
We had to prove that he was the person that had committed that murder. We knew he was involved and could prove that to the extent, and we then had to build a case.
There's no doubt that Ming Jiang tried to cover his tracks quite extensively, but the problem is there was just too much evidence. The evidence there in particular was extremely strong. It's almost the best evidence you can find at a scene, which was Yang Lu's blood and Ming Jiang's fingerprint.
Police now believe Ming Jiang murdered Yang Lu in his flat, dismembered his body, and dumped his torso in a suitcase before setting light to it. But they need to work out the link between the pair and establish when the murder happened, so trawl CCTV footage in the days leading up to the discovery of the suitcase.
CCTV footage revealed a man getting off the tram in Manchester. He crossed the road to meet another man and they went in the direction of a flat in Beswick.
That tram stop was the closest one to where Ming Jiang's home address was.
The male he met up with perfectly fit the description of Ming Jiang. And in addition to that, we had telephone evidence that showed the two phones of Ming Jiang and Yang Lu came together. And interestingly, from that point onwards, the phones always remained together. And that was the very last time that Yang Lu was seen.
With the evidence building, police make a decision.
So I authorised one charge of murder.
Ming Jiang denies any involvement in the murder, so the police and prosecution need to build a case for trial and establish a motive, meaning they have to delve deeper into the lives of the two men.
Yang Lu was definitely a responsible young man. He invested in stocks and shares, and he knew how to make money. He was very clever in that sense. He'd built himself this brand new life in the UK. He really had a bright future ahead of him. Yang really enjoyed gambling. He was a very big gambler. He'd go to casinos quite often. He always gambled within his means, though. He was never irresponsible in that respect. Even though he had the money to gamble, he never went above and beyond.
So Ming Jiang was in a very different situation to Yang Lu. Ming Jiang was originally from China. He moved over to the UK. He lived in the Beswick area in North Manchester. He rented that flat. At the time of the murder, he really was in serious debt problems. He'd spent quite a long time at casinos. He was a regular gambler. In fact, so much so that he had VIP status.
We believe that they met in a casino when they share the same interest to gamble. They met in the Manchester casino.
But Yang Lu could never have imagined that their relationship could be so deadly.
Ming Jiang was very well known in the casino community. In some casinos, he had quite specialised status due to the large amounts of money that he was gambling. Yet in other casinos, He had markers on him due to his erratic and volatile behaviour. It was my understanding that he was a great fun guy to be around when he was winning, but it was a very, very different case when he was losing.
He lost a huge amount of money, and as far as we know, is sort of a £200,000 debt, and he's been chasing by the debtor, the creditor within the community.
It was the Crown's case that Ming Jiang had accrued extensive debts. We had knowledge that he had historically acquired over £270,000 worth of debt within 2 casinos. He was struggling to pay off those debts. We knew that he had pawned some wristwatches for over £15,000 to try and keep the debtors at bay.
Getting more and more desperate to pay off his debts, it appears Ming Jiang hatched an evil plan.
Ming Jiang was in huge amounts of debt. He had no income or wherewithal with which to repay that debt, and the only way he believed he could do that was either through his addiction of gambling and waiting for the big win, or through extreme measures. He used the alternative of planning the murder of his friend.
When the police found Ming Jiang, he was actually in possession of Mr. Yang Lu's passport and his bank cards. So at this point, it's safe to assume that he was trying to assume his identity.
So Ming Jiang had taken Yang Lu's life and then he took his identity. He basically used all his personal information in order to extract money through his bank cards. He even tried to sell his flat, and he was making good progress on that at the point at which he'd been arrested. There was nothing that he wouldn't do in order to extract as much money and value out of Yang Lu.
In Manchester, Ming Jiang's trial for the murder of Yang Lu begins.
So the trial was conducted in April of 2017. Shortly prior to the trial hearing, we did meet with the victims' parents, and we had to reassure them that we would do our utmost to be able to obtain justice for their son.
The court hears how Ming Jiang had a checkered history.
Ming Jiang was a Hong Kong national. Before he came to the UK, he was working as cabin crew for a German airline, where he was actually convicted for credit card fraud.
The police found that he had convictions in Germany for shoplifting, convictions for identity fraud and forgery of documents in Switzerland. He had convictions for credit card fraud in Scotland. So as a result of that, as the reviewing lawyer, it was my job then to write international letters of request. I had to make formal requests to Germany and Switzerland to obtain evidence of those convictions, which we then subsequently at the trial hearing submitted as evidence of bad character.
The prosecution believes Ming Jiang was planning to use his experience of identity fraud to build a new life for himself.
It appeared quite clearly that Ming Jiang understood his way around the financial system, and the kind of things that he did and the way that he adopted the identity, for example, by using Yang Lu's phone to contact banks, etc. That showed quite a little bit of knowledge of how to basically defraud and use identity theft to his advantage.
This was premeditated, it was planned. He had devised a plan as to how he was going to assume his victim's identity and obtain all of his assets and walk away. He was probably going to walk away from his debts, take what money he could get from his victim and return to China. I believe that would have been his plan.
The motive behind the murder was quite clearly greed. It was obvious that Ming Jiang understood that Yang Lu had a lot of money. He lived in a nice area of Manchester. He owned his own flat. He dabbled in stocks and shares, and the concept that they'd had together, we believe that there would have been some understanding from Ming Jiang's point of view that Yang Lu was pretty wealthy.
During the trial, Ming Jiang's story changes several times.
Ming Jiang showed no remorse whatsoever throughout the whole process. He came out with bizarre and incredulous accounts, changing the overall story on a number of occasions. Initially, he claimed that Yang Lu was an escort and that they were in a relationship. There was absolutely no evidence to support that.
So he wasn't consistent in his account that he was providing to the police. He did pursue that through to the trial hearing and maintained that it was a different Chinese male called Mr. Wong who had committed the act of murder, and he tried to distance himself by using this fictional character.
He later on claimed that there was a kind of third-party gangster-type individual who was involved that Yang Lu owed money to. Again, from an investigation point of view, we were able to show that that simply wasn't the case.
Ming Jiang fabricated Mr. Wong, and he gave the phone number to the police. However, when the police checked the record of the phone, and it's find out that the phone number is only created a date before they believed Liu Yang died.
So all the explanations that Ming Jiang provided were easily discounted and showed that he was just making things up as he went along.
The jury has shown CCTV from the night police believe Yang Lu was murdered in a bid to prove that Ming Jiang was the last to see him.
The evidence we used, we had a digital sequence of events that displayed all of the CCTV footage and the appropriate stills. So we had the stills showing that Ming Jiang was friends with the victim and that they had attended the casino together on the 3rd of October. And then subsequently, Ming Jiang had clearly lured him to his flat on the 5th of October, and we had a still digital photo of Yang Lu leaving the Metrolink tram stop at Velo Park, which was the closest one to Ming Jiang's home address.
From a CCTV point of view, that was the last point at which Yang Lu had been seen, so that was on the 5th of October.
So his movements shortly after the time that we believe that he had killed Yang Lu, he used the bank cards that he'd acquired. He used them at B&Q to purchase cleaning products, paint with which to paint the flat. He went to the petrol station on numerous occasions, and he was seen to be filling one, if not two, containers of petrol, which we then subsequently believe that he used to set the body on fire.
Having killed his supposed friend and made attempts to clean the evidence, it appears Ming Jiang goes back to doing what he loves best.
In the early hours of the 6th of October, Ming Jiang spent 30 minutes at the casino. He also spent time at the casino after the deposition. So in the early hours of the 10th of October, he spent around 4 hours. And if you can imagine, he literally just taken the torso of the body, he's dumped it up in Tinswhistle, and then he set it on fire, returned back to his flat, and the first thing he does is head to the casino to spend Yang Lu's money and gamble.
His actions aren't the actions of what you would expect a normal person to do. And it's a terrible thing to murder somebody. But then to murder somebody and dismember the body and then dump it and set on fire, it's just an incredibly callous act, and it probably speaks a lot about his character.
After hearing the evidence, the jury retires to consider its verdict.
So the jury in this case sat for 4 weeks, and under normal circumstances, you generally expect around about a day days deliberation per week. So under normal circumstances, it would take 4 days to come to a decision. But in this case, it only took them 4 hours, and that shows you really how overwhelming the evidence was.
After weeks of evidence is a very short period of time, and I believe would demonstrate that they were absolutely sure in a very short space of time that Ming Jiang was guilty of this offence.
At the point that they gave their verdict, Ming Jiang was completely emotionless. He showed nothing at all. At that point, he went back into custody and sentencing took place a week later. The judge actually sentenced him in his absence because he refused to come to court.
The presiding judge made a point of stating that the starting point for a sentence would be 30 years due to it being solely the sole purpose being for gain, and in this case for money. However, he outlined aggravating features such as the extensive dismemberment of the body, the complete lack of remorse, and the misleading of evidence. And he made a point of saying that it might be that the authorities never deem him to be safe to be returned to the community, and that he could spend the rest of his life in prison.
On the 2nd of May, 2017, Ming Jiang is sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 33 years. He has never revealed the whereabouts of Yang Lu's limbs or head.
The saddest thing about this murder is Ming Jiang's greed caused the loss of the life of a young 36-year-old man, leaving behind 2 very grief-stricken, distraught parents.
His family didn't know the last time they spoke to him on the phone, the last time they saw him in person was going to be the last time. I think, yeah, it's really devastating that they never got to say goodbye to their only son.
The killing of a grandmother, a mother and her 2 daughters sparked the biggest investigation Wales has ever seen, leading to 3 suspects within the police. The chilling Murder in the Valleys continues new Wednesday at 9.
Police have launched a murder inquiry after an elderly woman was found dead at her home in Fleckney.
I was gobsmacked. There's something could happen like this, literally on my doorstep.
This case was one of a kind. Not only the nature of it, but the brutal nature of it.
When I found out, it just floored me. How? Why could that happen?
This is an old lady who's been murdered and seriously sexually assaulted in her home.
How could somebody that I'd grown up with be capable of doing something like that?
A lot of people were generally scared.
This just doesn't look right.
There was no sign of forced entry, so it was obvious that it was somebody that she knew.
Open the door!
Right, at this moment in time, I'm arresting suspicion of murder.
7 miles south of Leicester, in the heart of the English countryside, lies the quaint village of Fleckney.
Fleckney is a quiet village. It's very close-knit. It's like it has its own little bubble. People are very, very close. Everybody knows everybody. Most people are related in Fleckney.
Beautiful rural settings, friendly people, local amenities fantastic. But yeah, lovely, lovely place to live and grow up in.
It's not the sort of place where a lot of crime happens. I'd been to Fleckney a few times that had nothing to do with crime. I'd been there to judge a talent contest. I think it was called Fleckney's Got Talent.
The people who live in Fleckney are generally well-to-do. It's quite a low-crime area. There are retiring people there. There's some retirement bungalows around there. There's not a lot of throughfare. The people who are in Fleckney are generally the people who live there rather than the people who visit there.
And it was this perfect, idyllic village that 72-year-old Jane Hings chose to retire to.
Jane was an only child, and her mum and dad sadly passed away years before, which left her on her own with no immediate family around. Jane was quite a private person. She didn't like everyone to know, her business, and kept herself to herself, really. But once you got to know her, she opened up more, and it was just fun. She had quirky ways about her, but she was kind and she was caring.
Everybody in Fleckney knew Jane. She relied on people to give her a lift to the hairdressers, to the shops, things like that. She was inoffensive in every way. People didn't have bad things to say about her. And in her life beforehand, she worked hard.
Jane took pride in her appearance. She'd always, regular having her hair done every few weeks, and she'd always sort of make sure she was nicely dressed and put on a bit of makeup, so she'd still try and make the effort to look nice.
Having worked overseas as a nanny, Jane had settled into retirement, whilst also taking care of her much-loved rescue dog, Paddy.
He was spoilt rotten. Everything she did was for Paddy. You'd go in, there'd be dog treats stacked up to the ceiling. We'd lie on a bed at night and could look with her.
Whilst Jane used friends and neighbours to help walk Paddy, in the summer of 2017, an accident meant she needed a lot more care.
Goodbye. Jane had a fall and was admitted to hospital for about 3 or 4 weeks.
She'd suffered some injuries when her dog Paddy had pulled her over, and then when she came out of hospital, that's when she needed the carers and she needed help in getting around, and she couldn't go very far.
But the community came together for Jane, and she slowly got back on her feet.
She was the sort of person that people warmed to, they liked her, and they were happy to help out.
Then, just a few weeks after leaving hospital, tragedy strikes.
On the Sunday morning, Jane's carers went in as they were meant to, about 7 o'clock in the morning. Jane's front door was unlocked, which is normal. They went in. She was laid in bed. The cover was pulled up over her head and both of her arms were raised above her head. When they peeled back the duvet, which had covered her head entirely, they saw that she had died.
The carers are puzzled that Jane's body is covered completely by the duvet and call for an ambulance. Then, they notice something else unusual. Items are out of place in Jane's usually meticulous house.
And when the ambulance arrived, they could see that she'd been dead for some time. And the paramedic who was there, he looked around and could see that there'd been an untidy search. Some drawers were open, some things were knocked over.
Items were strewn across the floor, drawers were open.
Here is a lady who's died with the cover over her head, with the arms raised above the head, and it looks like there's been a burglary that's taken place.
With police at the scene, suspicions grow that this is not a natural death, and the house is immediately cordoned off. But with no obvious injuries, how Jane died is still a mystery, which means detectives begin to theorise what could have happened to the pensioner.
Is it a burglary that's gone wrong? Is it Jane who's suffered a heart attack following a burglary, or whether she has passed away and then a burglary has happened afterwards, or whether this is somebody who has murdered Jane and then burgled the bungalow afterwards?
The first step for detectives is to establish how Jane died.
I received a phone call from the duty detective inspector who said they had a death. They weren't 100% happy with it, and they would value my opinion on what was going on.
Dr. Hamilton attends the scene And as well as the unusual way Jane has been tucked into her bed, his suspicions are raised further.
And the most immediately concerning thing was that her nightdress appeared to be pulled up. And that seemed very unusual for somebody who'd simply died in their sleep. This just doesn't look right, it doesn't look normal.
As suspicions are raised that she could have been the victim of a sexual attack, Jane is taken for post-mortem. But almost immediately, everything changes.
This is HFM.
Police have launched a murder inquiry after an elderly woman was found dead at her home in Fleckney. The body was discovered in a bungalow on Elizabeth Road. It's thought the victim died at some point during Saturday evening or in the early hours of Sunday.
Whilst transporting Jane, a shocking piece of evidence has been found.
As we took the body, a tongue bar fell from one of the creases in the skin. Ms. Hings didn't have a tongue piercing, so we have evidence of somebody else very close to her body. That ultimately became one of the most important pieces of evidence in catching the killer.
On a quiet Sunday morning in the village of Fleckney in Leicestershire, residents are waking up to disturbing news of a possible murder on their doorstep.
This is HFM.
Further tests are being carried out to try to determine what killed an elderly woman in her own home in Fleckney. It prompted police to launch a murder inquiry following the discovery of her body in the property on Elizabeth Road. There were signs of a disturbance in her bungalow, which has led officers to believe she may have been the victim of a burglary.
72-year-old Jane Hings has been found dead by her carers early on a Sunday morning. Her house has been burgled, and there's signs she has been sexually assaulted. Police are treating her death as suspicious and have cordoned off the scene.
There was police tape from the tree round to the lamppost. You couldn't get to where, if you can just see that red car behind this thing, that was all blocked off as well, because that's the back of her house. It's not something we expected to ever happen in Fleckney. It's such a quiet village, a nice village. I was gobsmacked. There's something could happen like this, you know what I mean, on my doorstep, literally on my doorstep. And for people that I knew.
It's a place where you could leave your doors and windows open. Everybody knows everybody. But, you know, this sent shockwaves through the community. And I think that a lot of people would have felt generally scared.
With the village inundated with police vehicles, Jane's loved ones are also confronted with the news of her death.
I'd arranged to go over to Jane's on the Sunday morning to take Paddy for a walk. And as usual, I was running late. And I'd had no phone call, which was really strange. And then I pulled into the place where she lived and just saw loads of police cars, police vans, forensics, and yeah, that's when I found out. So I last spoke to Jane the night before. I was supposed to go and see her that day. I'd been on holiday, so I hadn't seen her for a couple of weeks. And we were on the phone for about an hour. I miss Jane. I miss the phone calls. There was so much she could have talked about her life, and I didn't get to hear any of it. And my phone is so deadly quiet all the time.
Whilst moving Jane's body, pathologists have discovered a tongue bar in her groin.
The investigation then shifted from, is this a burglary that's gone wrong, to this is an old lady who's been murdered and seriously sexually assaulted in her home.
That tongue bar was put into an evidence bag immediately. Everyone knew that this was potentially important. That went straight off. It was fast-tracked through the DNA lab.
As detectives wait for the DNA results, upmost on their mind is that this might not be an isolated incident.
One of our first lines of inquiry is to research cases of a similar nature, and we conducted a number of checks looking at anybody who was already convicted and in prison who could have been on day release for the same offence. But then this case was one of a kind. Not only the nature of it, but the brutal nature of it.
Immediately, door-to-door inquiries begin.
When officers initially attended the scene, they tried to identify people who would know Jane the last time that she was seen or spoken to.
Officers investigate whether Jane had any enemies in the village.
When we looked at Jane's past, there was no fallouts with anybody. There was nothing to indicate somebody with a vendetta, somebody with a grudge, any past history with anybody which would tell us this person has a long-running grudge against Jane and would want ill of her.
But locals have their own suspicions.
When the police first came, they said there was no sign of forced entry or anything like that, so it was obvious that it was somebody that she knew.
And it appears that whoever stole from Jane took some of her most precious items. Her wedding ring and a necklace are missing, along with her mobile phone, handbag, and £200. But police find an item they suspect doesn't belong to her.
Behind that bed, between the headboard and the wall, was a baseball cap found on the floor.
It was a designer cap, something that didn't belong to Jane.
The question police want to know is, whose hat is it? And did its owner have anything to do with Jane's death? With the post-mortem results in, it's apparent Jane has suffered a brutal attack.
Really tellingly, she had lacerations, she had tears, both to her anus and to her vagina. The external injuries were really focused around the mouth and the nose and the upper neck area. Ms. Hings didn't have that many injuries on her body, but what there was told a story. There was a little linear graze, a scratch on her neck, and we know that her necklace was missing. It would certainly fit with somebody having pulled that necklace and it scraping across the skin. The most important thing that the post-mortem brought out in itself was that there was no natural cause for her to die. No natural cause for Miss Hings to be dead. In addition, there was some quite disturbing bruising around her jawline, around her mouth, something that really makes you think we have to be sure that this woman hasn't been strangled or smothered.
Less than 24 hours after Jane was discovered, the fast turnaround DNA profile from the tongue bar is returned from the lab.
That profile was put into the DNA database and they soon had a match. They had a hit, and that match was Craig Kehoe.
26-year-old Craig Kehoe's DNA was on file, as he was known to the local police as a petty criminal. Now, he was part of a major manhunt.
Craig Kehoe was a local lad. He grew up in the area. He still lived in the area. Craig led a transient lifestyle. He doesn't have a car, he didn't have a phone, he didn't have a job, he didn't claim benefits. So trying to work out where he lived in the Fleckney area meant we had to do a lot of inquiries at a fast pace, but in a discreet way as well.
Police managed to trace Craig to a caravan which was on the outskirts of Fleckney, but not very far from where Jane lived.
Once we'd identified that he was living in a caravan, we sent officers there.
Someone in the caravan! Police! Open the door! Police, open the door! Someone with the dark hair in there.
And there was a slight standoff of about 30 seconds where the caravan was surrounded and Craig took some time coming to the door before he was arrested.
Right, hands behind back.
Right, at this moment in time, I'm arresting suspicion of murder. Arrest necessary for prompt and effective investigation. You don't have to say anything. May harm to face. Do not mention one question. Something which later will lie in the court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. Do you understand everything I've said to you?
Craig is taken into custody as detectives try to build a picture of the young man they suspect murdered Jane.
He didn't live far from Jane. He was a former factory worker. He'd been in trouble for burglary, a few break-ins and stealing from his parents and from a friend. But he wasn't known as a major criminal. He wasn't known for anything as horrific as this.
As Craig's DNA was identified on the tongue bar and in her bungalow, detectives want to know how it got there. Craig is interviewed under caution.
When was the last time you saw her then?
The last time I saw her was Sunday night.
Okay. What time would that have been?
I got there for about 10:30.
You got there at 10:30?
Yeah.
That's PM?
About 10:30 at night.
At night? Okay. So if we take from 10:30 at night then, through to when you left at 11?
Yeah.
Tell me exactly in detail what happened.
Well, we were watching the little film on the TV, and then she asked me to have sex with her again.
Just tell me exactly what she said to you about having sex.
She just said, "Craig, will you have sex with me?" And then, well, the first time it started off was about a month ago, and I was in the house, and then she just came into the front room naked, and then she was like, "Craig, come and do it with me and I'll pay you."
He offered the reason that his DNA was inside of Jane and inside the scene was because Jane had paid him for sex.
Okay, and how much did she pay you?
Yeah, she paid me £200.
£200?
In the village of Fleckney in Leicestershire, police have arrested 25-year-old Craig Keogh on suspicion of the murder of Jane Hings.
Do not have to say anything. May harm to face. Do not mention one question. Something which later will lie in the court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. Do you understand everything I've said to you?
Could this local lad really be responsible for the rape and murder of a 72-year-old pensioner? The news has sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community.
How could somebody that I'd grown up with all these years could be physically capable of doing something like that? I felt sick and it was horrible. Like, who does think something like that? To such, you know what I mean? You hear about it, but she was an old lady. She was old. He was a young lad.
Keogh has been taken into custody and is being interviewed under caution. With his DNA found on the victim and at the scene, detectives want to know how Craig knows Jane. And he has an explanation.
I was walking through the village, and I saw this lady, and her shopping bag broke, and I helped her, and then I carried it to the house with her.
Craig told us in an interview that he met Jane when he was down the shops, and that she asked him to pick up some shopping for him and offered him some money for it, and then asked him to walk her dog, Paddy, as well.
But Craig alleges that it wasn't just household chores Jane was paying him for.
And then another time, she's asked me to have sex with her for money. And it happened a month ago, the first time. And then she's asked me to come back a month later. And then it happened again.
Key to the police investigation was the tongue piercing found in Jane's groin.
Have you got any piercings?
I got my ear pierced.
Your ear pierced? Okay. Anywhere else?
Yeah, my tongue pierced.
Your tongue?
Craig goes on to admit that he'd been with Jane the night she died, saying he arrived at her house around 10:30 p.m.
Tell me exactly in detail what happened.
Well, I was watching the little film on the TV, and then she asked me to have sex with her at the end, and she's like, "I'll pay you more this time." I was like, "Okay." I didn't think anything of it, and that was it really. And she said she felt sick, and then I left her.
Craig's detailed account that he had sex with Jane and left her very much alive turns the investigation on its head.
During the course of his interviews, he came up with an explanation as to what happened. And I have to say, it was so bizarre.
Craig also suggested that Jane, whilst alive, was unwell when he left.
What he was saying was that she'd become a little bit wobbly and a little bit unwell, and had then gone back to her bed. He'd then closed the door, and obviously whatever happened afterwards was someone else. Some stranger, no doubt having seen that the door was open, would have gone in there, burgled her, and perhaps killed her. And so that might possibly have been an explanation for what happened.
The interviewing officers had to keep an open mind, but had to probe and get as much detail from him as possible to find out whether it was right or not.
Was Craig telling the truth? Was Jane alive when he left? And so was it someone else who sexually assaulted and killed her? Forensics carry out a detailed search for additional DNA or fingerprints on Jane or in the bungalow.
There was nothing else from the scene, from Jane, from the post-mortem which identified anybody else other than Craig. We'd had all of these things examined, and they only pointed at Craig Keogh and did not point to anybody else.
With no one else in the frame, Craig's movements on the night in question are investigated.
Craig had been on a night out in Oadby, a nearby town.
I think it was between 8:30 he came in that night. Remember it well because Leicester City had played Liverpool on that night, so we had a fair few in. He stood out straight away because he had his baseball cap the other way around, and he was just bouncing up and down.
Staff at the pub said that he appeared agitated, aggressive, and almost as if he was up for a fight. They said he was high on drink and drugs.
Now, this was crucially important evidence because in his interviews, he'd said that by 10:30 that evening, he was sitting in Jane Hing's living room in Fleckney, watching a war film and having a drink with her. That was a lie. He was out with his friends. We were able, by that process, to show that he'd taken cocaine, that he was offering to sell other people cocaine, and that he was complaining about how boring the evening was.
As doubt is cast on Keogh's version of events, police trace his movements after he leaves the pub. He's next seen arriving back in Fleckney at just after 1 a.m.
His friends say that the last time they saw him was when the taxi dropped him off and they assumed he was going home.
But Keogh walks in the opposite direction of his caravan, heading in the direction of Jane's bungalow.
We knew from CCTV that the suspect had walked to Jane's house wearing a baseball cap, and when they were walking away, they didn't have it on, and we could see that.
Detectives believe this places Keogh in Jane's bungalow around 1:15 a.m. And when he returns home, he's captured again.
We see him going back into his caravan, carrying something. Now, he goes out again, and he returns out around 2:30 in the morning for another 15 minutes or so, and we are certain that he went back to Jane Hing's house in that period of time. We don't know what he did.
The following morning, Craig is again seen on camera.
The morning after he was seen walking along the street, he was captured on CCTV with a black bin bag.
He's spotted again a few minutes later, but the bag has vanished. What did he dispose of? The police believe it was some of Jane's belongings, but a search of the area reveals nothing.
This is HFM.
It's 5 o'clock. This is HFM News. Detectives have been given more time to continue questioning a man on suspicion of murder following the discovery of a pensioner dead in her bungalow in Fleckney on Sunday morning. Officers also believe items were stolen from Miss Hings's bungalow in a black bin liner. They're appealing for villagers to check their gardens and outbuildings in case it's been discarded there. A post-mortem examination has so far failed to identify her cause of death.
With help from the public and CCTV, police are able to piece together Keogh's movements 24 hours after Jane's death. Friends described Craig as splashing his cash, buying them drinks and himself a new tongue bar.
He tried to get rid of Jane's jewellery in trying to sell it. He got rid of her handbag. He was trying to get rid of every last bit of evidence that would connect him to Jane.
He went into Leicester city centre and he actually went to a pawnbroker's. He sold her jewellery for about £100 when the items of jewellery were valued around £1,000.
With enough evidence that Keogh stole items from Jane and had raped her, detectives also believe they have a killer on their hands. But proving he murdered Jane was going to be their biggest challenge.
So far as murder was concerned, we had no cause of death. We were unable to show how she died, whether it was deliberate or accidental, forensically at that stage.
In the village of Fleckney, 25-year-old Craig Keogh has been charged with burglary, murder, and the rape of pensioner Jane Hings. The news that Jane was sexually assaulted in her home has been made public.
The community were on edge already, knowing that an old lady had been murdered in her home, but then once the true nature of it came out, people were really worried.
When I found out that information, it just floored me. It played on my mind all night. You know, a woman of that age, how, why could that happen?
I'd say the villagers would be distressed because a majority of them are similar sort of age to Miss Hinks. And you know, and there's quite a few vulnerable people out there as well, and it obviously upset them, but also put a bit of fear into them as well, that this could happen on their doorstep.
Within days of his arrest, Keogh is brought before a judge and the charges read.
He pleaded not guilty to all the charges, so that was murder, 2 counts of rape and burglary.
Keogh is remanded in custody and a date set for his trial. But the work of the prosecution is only just beginning.
This was horrific violence perpetrated on a very frail old lady whilst she was still alive. And there was then the added complication of trying to prove how she died.
So one of Craig Keogh's lines of defence actually referred to him knowing Jane Hings, and yeah, he said that she paid him for sex, and that was a reason that he went around and he claimed she was still alive when he left her bungalow on that night.
Experts believe that Jane has been smothered with a pillow, and proving it was Keogh is imperative to the case.
The DNA on the pillows was of saliva, and so we could show that Jane's saliva was on the pillows. That was all.
Typically with a material object, you can't get fingerprints from it. And it's really difficult. For us as investigators, we sat there believing that the pillowcases were our murder weapon. How could we prove that?
With concern that Keogh might get away on a technicality, the the police and prosecution reach out to forensic specialists.
Now, our pillowcases had been sat in the bottom of an evidence bag, sat in an exhibit store for, at this point, 4 months. They weren't laid out flats like you'd see in a movie or anything like this. This is a pillowcase shoved in the bottom of an evidence bag.
But as we got nearer to trial, we discovered a new scientific development.
Leicestershire Police said to me they had a pillowcase that they were interested in trying to develop some fingerprints on. They wanted to know whether a novel process I'd been researching was appropriate for this type of exhibit. I recommended that they tried vacuum metal deposition, and I also directed them towards Gloucestershire Police, who had a vacuum metal deposition machine that they could use and a trained operator, which is probably the best technique that we're aware of that gives you a chance of getting fingerprints on fabrics.
Vacuum metal deposition involves vaporizing gold and zinc in a vacuum chamber. The metallic particles are attracted to the fabric and form a negative image of finger marks wherever it has been touched.
So what you have here is the image of the pillowcase as it's come out of the vacuum metal deposition machine. These dark regions where you have quite a lot of zinc deposition, and you have these light regions where zinc simply hasn't deposited. It shows whereabouts the pillowcase has been gripped, and it also enables you to say, well, it's been touched there, so you can then target other techniques such as DNA recovery for those techniques.
We were able, therefore, to show that the pillow had been held in a position that you wouldn't hold a pillow ordinarily in order to put it over Jane Hing's head to kill her.
So that proved our murder weapon. We had Keogh's finger marks on the short edge and Jane's saliva in the middle of the pillow.
But the question is, would it be enough to convict Keogh? The trial begins at Birmingham Crown Court, and Jane's friends come face to face with Keogh.
Craig was just deadpan through the whole entire time. Not an ounce of remorse, not any kind of emotion. He showed nothing.
When Craig sat in the dock, he was expressionless. It was difficult to really see any signs of emotion.
Obviously, Jane's friends are of her age, so are a lot older and didn't want to go and sit through all of that. So I went and sat for her. I didn't want Craig to think that nobody cared about her. I wanted to be seen that, you know, she meant something to somebody.
Craig had denied all along that he was responsible for raping and murdering Jane Hings. In fact, his version of events was at complete odds with the prosecution's case, the police case. He had said that he had gone to see Jane to have sex. He said that they had watched a film together that night, a war film. Checks were made, and there was no war film on TV. It was a complete and utter lie.
As the trial unfolds, the defence tried to paint a picture of Jane.
Craig Keogh was describing Jane Hings as being a sexually promiscuous, drunken woman who liked nothing more than spending her pension money on having intercourse with a young man. We discovered she didn't drink alcohol. There was no alcohol in her bloodstream after her death.
So the jury were then shown all the mobility aids that Jane had in the house, the fact that she couldn't walk between rooms without needing a walking stick or a frame.
So the idea of her being interested in active sexual activity was laughable.
Central to the prosecution case is proving that the sexual contact was non-consensual.
So we instructed an expert in sexual injuries to examine her body. And as a result of that, we were able to show that the sexual activity was not consensual activity, and it would have caused her significant amounts of pain, and it happened when she was alive.
And it was for this reason they believe Keogh decided to kill Jane.
She must have cried out when that happened, and he must have wanted not to be caught and to complete the act. And we know he did complete the act because there was semen within her body. And I expect that during the course of that sexual assault upon her, he decided to kill her because she wouldn't shut up.
Establishing that Keogh had the motive and opportunity to kill Jane, the prosecution introduces what they believe is the murder weapon.
The scientists went the extra mile on this one because they could show that finger marks left by Keogh were on the short, straight edges at the side, and they were gripped like this and applied. And they then took it one step further to look for the amylase staining, that's the protein staining in the middle, to show that Jane had exhaled a lot and given out a lot of moisture from her breath, indicating that that's where she was smothered. And then when the scientists came to court to explain it, the jury was sat there like, oh wow, this is really impactful.
With the prosecution evidence built against him, Keogh remained silent.
Craig sat there very quiet. He chose not to give evidence. He chose not to be cross-examined by prosecutor, and he showed no remorse, even when the horrific details were read out of what he had done.
Craig Keogh could not offer any evidence which the jury could look at and say that he was not guilty. He couldn't offer any alibi, and he couldn't offer any plausible explanation as to why this had happened or why he was suspected of it.
After 5 days, the jury is sent to deliberate. Presented with all the evidence, they have to decide whether the marks at the edge of the pillow and all the new scientific data prove that the young man in front of them is a murderer.
There are two choices for a jury here. Either he went into that house and raped her and burgled the property and then left, and a random stranger came in and smothered her, or the person who raped her smothered her. That's the choice.
Even though you've listened to the whole trial and you know he's guilty, the evidence says he's guilty, those minutes, hours of waiting to hear them words, it's still nerve-wracking, you know, because they could come back with not guilty.
After 4 hours, the jury returns.
They came back and unanimously said that he was guilty of 2 counts of rape, murder and burglary.
When the jury came back, he was plainly shocked. Craig Keogh stood there, and when sentence was imposed, he stood there with an element of resignation, but he didn't seem at any stage to show any kind of remorse. No sadness for her, no sadness for his own family, who appeared to be very decent people. From the beginning to the end, it seemed to me he was entirely focused on himself.
Keogh was given a life sentence and will only be eligible for parole after 32 years. But for all involved, this case has taken its toll.
When I went into Jane Hing's house, I was struck by the peace and tranquility in which she'd lived her life. She was a very simple lady. Beside her bed on one side was her Bible and a crucifix. And on the other side, as she had gone to bed, no doubt like every other night, she'd left her teeth on the side of the bed. And imagining just being in your own bedroom, in the comfort of your own home, and having a young, strong man, plainly intoxicated and under the influence of drunks, coming into your room about 1:15 in the morning, waking you from your sleep, must have been terrifying. That, I think, stays with me.
This case will stick with me It's one that the community will remember for a long time. It's one that the police officers who went to will remember for a long time.
I've covered numerous murder trials over the last 25 years. The rape of anyone is distressing, it's shocking, but this was particularly shocking because it involved the rape of an elderly woman.
I've been asked many times, what are my feelings towards Craig? And I have none, is the simple answer. I don't hate him because that's an emotion. I literally have no emotion towards him. But to think of what he did, it broke my heart to try and think about the fear that would have been going through her mind at the time. And then to be smothered with her own pillow. Jane was cremated and I put her ashes in an urn that sits on my mantelpiece so she can watch over Paddy every day until the day that he sadly joins her, in which case I will get him cremated and scatter their ashes someplace nice. Are you gorgeous? So they can be together again.
Stranger danger is rare but not impossible. The chilling Murdered at First Sight is new Wednesday at 9 on Sky Mix.
Is it the building that's on fire?
It is, yeah.
It is, okay then.
I got out, I managed to get them.
Right then. It's okay, is everybody out of the building?
No, there's still my partner in.
Right, is he able to get out of the building?
No, because there's fires near the door.
When the call came in, it seemed an unlikely town and an unlikely venue for this sort of thing to happen. At a joinery shop, after tea, when you wouldn't expect people to be working, things just didn't seem quite right.
Everybody was really quite worried. You know, it could have been the person that you walked past in the street, it could have been anybody.
I don't know how anybody could live with it, knowing that they burnt somebody alive.
Everybody was so shocked and everybody was locking up more and feeling a bit worried about it all because nothing like this had ever happened in the village.
A few miles from the bustling seaside resort of Skegness sits the small, picturesque market town of Burgh-le-Marsh, affectionately known by its residents as the Village.
Everybody here calls it a village because we feel like village people. We're so connected and so we help one another.
Burgh-le-Marsh is a typical Lincolnshire village on the edge of the Lincolnshire Wolds, famous for its windmill, where people are hard-working and just get on with their lives.
I've had a salon in Burgh-le-Marsh for 14, 15 years and it's a lovely, quiet village where everybody knows everybody. Everybody gets on with everybody and my clients are lovely.
But the peaceful tranquility of the village is about to go up in flames.
We've just gone up to the workshop to pick some things out.
Yeah.
And somebody came up with us behind.
Yeah.
And they attacked us and set fire to the place.
The workshop on fire belongs to well-known local couple David Twigg and Julie Dixon, who own a joinery business next to their home. As the emergency call comes in, Lincolnshire Fire and Rescue Station Commander Gary Milson is immediately dispatched to the scene.
Once I received the call, I'd be straight into my car and making headway down to Burgh-le-Marsh. It's only a few miles down the road. There's not a lot of time to mull over things and get other information in. The information that was relayed to me at that point was that two men dressed in black and wearing balaclavas had accosted David Twigg and his partner. They'd locked David into the storeroom and then proceeded to pour petrol into the foyer of the building and lit it before fleeing the scene. As I approached the premise, there was a white picket fence surrounding it. It seemed quite surreal, the appliances at the bottom with the lights on. As I walked past that towards the entrance where the activity was taking place, the incident commander gave me a quick brief and said that there was very little fire and the fire was out, and they was now trying to locate David Twigg, who they'd been informed was locked in a room inside the building.
With the blaze having been brought under control and extinguished, Gary and his team desperately tried to locate David Twigg.
The workshops were an old railway buildings. They were long and thin, and at the end there was a small area with a kitchen, a storeroom and a toilet and a small foyer that linked these all together. And they were all involved in the fire. They was all black and heated and sooty, but they were all empty apart from the storeroom door that was locked. There was no keys present. The decision was made that the wall might be easier to break through than the door, and a hole was made in the wall, and we could see that there was somebody who appeared to be on the knees facing the door. We tried to rouse them through shouting and speaking to them, but there was no response.
With David not responding, the urgency to reach him grows and the fire crew break deeper into the wall, releasing the door.
As the door opened, David Twigg fell forward into our arms and forward onto the floor. The crews immediately turned him over and began resuscitation. We had an ambulance already in attendance and the paramedics were very quickly there, and we assisted the paramedics in placing him into the ambulance where they could work on him further.
In the back of the ambulance, paramedics battle to resuscitate David Twigg.
The time frame from the call to us getting David out of the cupboard may have been around about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we worked on him for probably another 15-20 minutes after that before the paramedics decided to call time and pronounce him dead.
With David dead, the situation immediately changes, and a murder investigation is launched.
The first information I got was that there'd been a fire at a business premises near Skegness in Lincolnshire, of course, and that two men had been involved. They'd made off, where they hadn't been found at the moment. A man had tragically died, believed to be the owner of the business, and his partner, who worked with him, a lady, had been quite badly injured in the incident. She was being taken to hospital to be treated, and officers were at the scene. So lots of things going through your mind, but at no stage anything other than, this is a murder case. It's tragic. David Twigg has died, and we need to find these two people as soon as possible.
With fire crews, police and paramedics at the scene, it isn't long before news of the tragedy spreads around the town.
It was a big event for Lincolnshire. A robbery homicide in a small village like Borough-le-Marsh is something that had never happened before in my 25 years covering the area, and it may well never happen again.
Rumours I heard was they was looking for two men, and my house faces a back field, and of course the drones was going over there. There was quite some noise, and I couldn't believe it actually.
The whole village were stunned that something could have happened on the doorsteps.
It was big news, and everybody was really quite worried that whoever did it could have been out there and they could have been next. You just don't know.
There was a lot of anxiety in the community. Borough-le-Marsh is a long way from the nearest police station, a long way sometimes from the nearest police officer. And local people were obviously very concerned that they may be the victim of a similar burglary.
In the Lincolnshire town of Borough-le-Marsh, police have launched a murder investigation after local joiner David Twigg was pronounced dead following a fire at his workshop. His partner, Julie Dixon, had managed to escape and call 999, reporting that masked intruders had broken in, locked David in the storeroom, and set the place on fire.
The impact on the local community after this happened was immense. That's the only way I can describe it. I was clearly getting phone calls. The local community officers were being stopped in the street. People were going to the police station. There was a kind of sense of not just why has this happened, but who's responsible, and just as importantly, is it going to happen again? Is somebody else going to be, the target of these two individuals? And nobody could think of a reason why David and Julie would be targeted.
David Twigg was an only son. He grew up in the area. His parents remained in the area. He was a master joiner, very popular and a hard-working man in the local area. He was also a very big man, well over 6 feet tall and 19 stone, but he was a presence in the community.
David met Julie in 1996 when she was going through a divorce. The pair quickly moved in together.
They remained together for 15 years. They came across as a typical middle-aged couple. In Borough La Marche, David and Julie were seen as a team. David was the carpenter, the joiner at the business, and Julie was doing the finance and the accounts for the business.
Outside of joinery, David soon discovered a new hobby, stock car racing, which opened up a whole new social circle for him and Julie, with professional racer John Mickle and his wife Lisa.
So from that very first race meeting, really kind of just kicked it off. We enjoyed each other's company. They wanted to come to every single race meeting. They wanted to be involved.
And David soon found a way to combine work with his newfound love when he set up a sideline alongside his joinery company.
As David's business grew, he was quite happy to sponsor the motor racing team. That was one of his passions, and so they undertook that deal, which was several £1,000s.
Julie and David were keen to promote this new Kitchen Bits and Bobs business, which is an online business that they were trying to get off the ground. I think they felt that probably some branding on the race cars, and then obviously we can promote it through social media as well.
The sponsorship proved very successful. David particularly got on very well with the racing team, and they were invited over to America to watch the team racing, and all seemed well. It was a very happy relationship, and he got on very well with them.
I think from the beam on his face when we first, agreed at Liddon Hill, he just seemed incredibly proud. He seemed very smiley. You could tell he was passionate about his business, and this was something that he felt was going to enhance the people that would see his work.
The friendship between the two couples started to grow stronger.
I think from the very first time we met them, I really, really liked what they brought to the team and, the energy. And we call it a race family, and it just felt like they were going to become part of our race family. Julie wanted to be hands-on with me in the kitchen, while David was very quick to throw himself into the deep end with John on the mechanic side as well. They just got stuck in. It wasn't just about the racing anymore. They started to get quite involved. She wanted to be involved in the family life that we had as well. She would buy presents for my children, who were aged 4 and 7 then. They looked fondly upon her and David as well. So they became family friends.
And it was Lisa Julie turned to in the aftermath of the tragedy of David's death.
The very first time I heard about David was on Monday morning. I had a phone call somewhere between 7 and 7:30 in the morning from Julie. She basically was hysterical. She was shouting down the phone, "He's dead, he's dead." And I really didn't have a clue what she was even talking about. I didn't know who's dead. I said, Julie, who's dead? She said, David's dead. And I then tried to get some more information. You know, what's happened? She said, a fire. So none of her sentences were very long. It was just words being thrown out at me. I said, a fire? What? There's a house fire? She said, no, workshop, fire, masked men, attacked. From that phone call, I immediately knew I had to go and visit her straight away. I knew it would be a long journey up to Lincolnshire, probably 4 hours. I just grabbed my purse, my keys, and left. So the 4 hours going there was, it's a very weird and surreal situation. You keep thinking, you know, has this really happened? Is this some kind of, you know, is this true? Is it real? I just can't get my head around it. It's an awful lot of information, hearing her so upset on the phone. And those words, he's dead, they just kept playing and playing in my head.
When Lisa arrives at Julie's parents' house, she finds Julie in a state of shock.
Julie was sitting and rocking in a chair. I was absolutely taken back when I first saw her because she had burns on her face. She told me that her and David, on the Sunday, had gone down to the yard, which is just a short stroll from the house, to lock up. That's all they were doing. They were going to lock up. She said that she had asked David to go into the storeroom to get a light bulb. And these two men wearing balaclavas, dressed in black and hoodies, had come into the barn, had locked David in the cupboard, and then had grabbed her. And that they had tried and forced her towards this circular saw. I asked her how she got away, and she said, I just squirmed out of... She said, lucky I was wearing a hoodie. I squirmed out of it and ran. She said she ran out of the door, she ran across the field, and then I think after a short space of time, she turned round to look back to see that these intruders were also leaving the premises and that they'd shut the door behind them. She was then concerned about David, so she went back to the barn. And when she opened the door, suddenly the combustion, the flames, that's what had caused the burns to her face.
While Lisa consoles her heartbroken friend, police turn up to interview Julie as a key witness to the crime.
She was only able to give some basic details. We didn't want to push too hard, of course. She's a victim, she's lost David in the most awful circumstances. Clearly the 999 call provided us with a little bit of information, which was helpful, but we wanted to try and dig deeper if we could, so we had to ask those difficult questions as early as possible. She was interviewed by specially trained officers, but sometimes it just wasn't possible to continue with interviews because Julie wasn't in a emotionally fit state to carry on at that point. So we had to do lots of short sections rather than a really long and draining and demanding interview.
With little information gleaned from Julie and unease growing among the locals, police turned to the public for help.
In the hours that followed, Lincolnshire Police made appeals for the intruders and did reveal that a 999 call had been made by Julie Dixon and gave the description of these two masked men who had been to the workshop, and that Julie had managed to push one of them away and escape, and then rang the fire brigade on 999.
I remember holding more than one press conference, which wasn't just local and regional, it was national as well, because this was big news in terms of, you know, what had happened and where it had happened and the type of community that it was affecting.
As Lincolnshire Police continued to make these appeals, we would take that information and circulate it amongst the various radio stations, local newspapers, daily newspapers in Lincolnshire. And the police were obviously very anxious to get that message out as wide as possible.
With Lincolnshire Police desperately trying to piece together the events of the night and establish the identity of the masked men, Fire Commander Gary Milson scours the crime scene for clues.
Once the fire's been extinguished, we then start on the scene preservation side of it, And as we withdraw from the building, we're trying to make sure that anything that has been removed out of the building is logged or is placed back into the building with care, so that should we need to, we can rebuild that picture, that jigsaw puzzle, to help us find out how the fire started.
I've dealt with quite a few fires, and unfortunately fatal fires as well, and murder cases, and it's probably one of the most challenging cases that you have to deal with, because by its very nature, fire destroys, and fire destroys evidence, not just the fire itself, but the water that's used.
Having established petrol was used as the accelerant, Senior Investigating Officer Stuart Gibbon begins trying to make sense of the scene.
All police officers and detectives are constantly reminded about how important the golden hour is. It's a time where you can lose evidence, but if you get it right and you gather the evidence and you secure and preserve that evidence, it can have a positive impact on the rest of the investigation. The golden hour in this particular investigation was kind of twofold. One was about securing the workshop to make sure that we could get access to it and that nobody else used it, and it could be forensically examined over a period of days, which it was. Also, from a financial point of view, it wasn't going to be a kind of random attack. That is something that I almost eliminated from a very early stage, simply because of where it is. So was it a customer that had been in before? And then you start to think about the reasons why. Is it financial? Is it a robbery or a burglary that's gone wrong? Did David owe somebody some money and they were trying to recover the money? So we drafted in a financial investigator working with the police, and he was starting to look at the actual basics of the business, how it was doing financially, what was going on.
Could David have been targeted for money? Was it a revenge attack for a business deal gone wrong? Or something closer to home?
So Julie did actually send me a few messages, and she called me quite distressed, probably a couple of weeks before David was killed. She did say that her telephone had been cut off, but then was restored again. She said that her electricity had been cut off, but restored again. She felt that someone was messing around with them.
Aware that this information could be key to the investigation, Lisa contacts the police.
So we had what are known as a POLSA team, Police Search Advisor team, specialist search officers that did a kind of fingertip search in the parameters around the building. And actually they found something which appeared quite significant. Deposited in some bushes on a neighbouring piece of land next to the joinery workshop, they found some keys, and we were able to establish at a slightly later point that one of those keys fitted the storeroom that David had been locked inside. So this is quite a significant find for us. Obviously those items were forensically examined, they didn't yield any evidence, but the finding of those keys supported at that point the account that Julie Dixon had given, because they were found in the direction that the two offenders were alleged to have gone off in.
Further inquiries begin to yield some surprising discoveries.
I think the first kind of breakthrough in terms of new information for the investigation wasn't, surprisingly, to do with the two offenders. It was to do with the financial affairs, if you like. We'd been led to believe by the inquiries that we conducted that the business was in a good place financially, that David was doing well, and that the accounts were healthy. In actual fact, when we had a financial investigator start to look more closely at the accounts and the business, the opposite was true. They were in dire financial straits, on the verge, if not already, bankrupt, and there was some serious financial issues.
Having been unaware of the financial issues at David's business, further inquiries throw up more concerns.
The post that was going to the business was supposed to be going to David Twigg Joinery, who had been redirected to this garage. And that was quite a big point for us as well, because then that begs the question, well, why is the post being redirected? Who's redirecting it? And what lies behind that?
In Lincolnshire, the investigation into the murder of David Twigg has thrown up some suspicious activity around his business.
It soon became clear that both the workshop and the bungalow where they lived had been remortgaged.
Finances were becoming a little bit more of a priority line of inquiry, and we needed also to know why the post was being redirected to another address. We were still keeping an open mind. Obviously, we were still trying to establish these two mass offenders, who they were, where they were, why they'd done what they did. But also these other things were starting to kind of build up in terms of the finances, first and foremost, very, very different to how we'd initially thought they were.
While the investigation homes in on David's financial affairs and whether his death could be linked to a business deal, 2 months after his murder, David's body is released so he can finally be laid to rest. Friend Lisa accompanies David's partner Julie to the funeral.
That was a huge, big turning point for us. Suddenly my gut feeling started to take over. The funeral, she acted very strange for someone that was basically saying the last goodbye to a partner. She would crack jokes, and quite inappropriate jokes, acting slightly inappropriately towards people. She was laughing very, very loud. Then suddenly she'd be upset. It just seemed really irrational. And I felt uncomfortable.
But it isn't just friends who have their concerns. Having uncovered some financial irregularities surrounding David and Julie's business, Lincolnshire Police have more questions.
Yeah, we were looking for answers to these questions, and the only person that really could probably provide them was Julie Dixon. I was conscious that we were asking her a lot of questions and being quite direct with her when actually, on the face of it, she was a victim of the most awful circumstances. But we had to ask those questions. We weren't always given the answers that we were looking for.
As well as the finances, police inquiries with David's creditors flag up something else.
All the inquiries that we carried out with the businesses and the authorities that were dealing with this financial debt, nobody had ever spoken personally or otherwise with David Twigg. Every kind of communication, be it on the telephone, email, that sort of thing, was with Julie Dixon. And what we also uncovered, which was really quite concerning, was that people were being told by Julie that David was terminally ill, that he was abroad on holiday, that he was really unable to take any calls for various different reasons. And this concerned us because we couldn't corroborate this in any way.
Having also discovered the post addressed to David's business was being redirected to a local garage, Stuart and his team trawl through the garage's CCTV, hoping it will reveal who is behind the redirection. Instead, they find another clue.
And when we examined that CCTV, we found that Julie had driven there in a vehicle on the morning of the murder and had filled up petrol cans with petrol at the location. And when we did challenge her with finding that information in the CCTV footage, she told us, yes, I did go to the garage that morning. We were doing some gardening and I needed to get some petrol to fill the lawnmower up. We established also that Julie had a BlackBerry type mobile phone. And as part of a murder investigation, you're always looking at mobile phone data because it can tell you a lot of things, and we couldn't get into it. So clearly we asked Julie on more than one occasion, could you please help us and tell us what the PIN number is so we can access this device? She was unable to do so. She said that she'd forgotten, she couldn't remember it. Clearly she had been using it very recently and on the day of the murder. We had evidence of that. If nobody else uses it and nobody else has changed the PIN or password, then she must know that number or that code. What's in that BlackBerry? Why won't she tell us the PIN number? We really desperately needed to get to the bottom of what had happened, and this was the point where the investigation focus really changed.
As the months tick by, friends of Julie also start to have their doubts as to what really occurred that fateful night.
One race meeting that I remember very, very clearly was the last race meeting that she's ever come to. When we arrived there was a police car there. She started screaming and hitting things, shouting at the top of her voice, making some very loud noises. And I just said, Julie, talk to me. What's wrong? Why are you upset? She sat, she rocked, she cried. She rocked, she cried. And then she started saying, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. And I just said, what are you sorry for? Tell me what you're sorry for. She rocked, she cried, I'm sorry. And it was like a repeated process. She said nothing else, she did nothing else.
While Julie spends a weekend away with friends, back at the investigation, forensic evidence starts to build up.
Now, the account Julie gave was that the two men had come in, there'd been a tussle, she'd managed to get out of the place, and she'd gone to ring 999, and then she'd noticed them running out, the two offenders, and they ran off round the back, and she went back in to try and rescue David or find him, and as she opened the door, there was a flashback, and she was hit with the fumes from the fire and the explosion. And that was how she got the injuries. Actually, forensic evidence would say otherwise, and would indicate that it was what's known as a vapour cloud.
When the petrol would be originally poured into the foyer and lit, as the petrol's ignited, the vapour cloud would ignite first. And anybody in that vicinity would get caught in that vapour cloud. And depending on the amount of vapour and the intensity of it, they may just get slight singeing and flash burns, or they could indeed get quite badly burnt. That seemed to be fitting more with the burns to Julie Dixon than rather what she was telling us, that she would open the door and it flared up. In fact, we considered it quite unlikely that she had opened the door and the petrol had flared up like that. Once it's lit, it's done that initial flare up, and it's unlikely that would happen again. There was a petrol can behind the door. Had she have opened the door right at the start of the fire, she would have moved the petrol can, so that evidence didn't add up.
We also recovered from a forensic examination of the bungalow some very small hairs in the bathroom sink. Now, again, on the surface, first viewing, not particularly relevant, but when we have those sent off to be forensically examined and we find out that they belong to Julie Dixon, those hairs, again, not particularly relevant, it's her bathroom, she uses the bathroom, there are going to be hairs. They were identified as eyelash or eyebrow hairs, but they were singed, they were burned. That put a kind of different slant on it as well.
Finding burned eyebrow hairs revealed Julie had gone into the bathroom after the fire had started, knowing full well her partner was trapped inside a burning building, something which raises suspicion among the police. Not only that, but the fire investigators believe Julie could only have received her injuries if she'd been inside the building when the fire started.
Julie Dixon had given various different accounts. She'd given us very little information. The more we tried to put to her by way of questions, the more withdrawn she'd become at that point, and actually became quite defensive at various times as well. And it was at that point that I made the decision, based on all the anomalies and the significant findings, she was going to be arrested on suspicion of the murder of her partner, David.
Three months after David's death, and news of Julie's arrest soon spreads around her hometown.
Obviously, there had been a lot of anxiety and fright in the community about intruders being at large. So in some ways, the arrest of Julie put that to bed. But equally, there was also some anger that obviously they'd spent 3 months believing Julie's story.
There was a lot of upset people. She had upset a lot of people because she befriended, well, she was everybody's friend. She was a very likeable person. And yeah, it was a big shock to everybody.
Julie Dixon is brought into the police station for formal questioning, this time as a suspect, not as a witness.
I was prepared, I thought, for most things to come from that interview, including a no-comment interview, which is quite common. So we'd gathered together as a group, the interviewing officers, the SIO, the interview coordinator, to discuss what could happen. But what actually did happen, I think it's fair to say, threw us all at that point. She provided a prepared statement, and what it said in a nutshell was that this whole situation had been a suicide pact. So what she said was that both her and David had wanted to die due to the dire financial circumstances around the business and personal issues, and that they were preparing to do just that, but that when the crunch came to lighting the petrol and setting the fire, she panicked and ran out of the building, leaving David behind.
In Lincolnshire, police are questioning David Twigg's partner on suspicion of his murder.
My initial thoughts were that if Julie was prepared to lie about two masked raiders and invent a story around what had actually happened, then what else had she lied about?
In interview, Julie claims the fire was a joint suicide pact, but that she had panicked and fled. So police need to establish if there is any truth in her account.
Let's go back and speak to friends and family. What sort of state of mind was David in? And actually, fairly quickly, it was established that he was in a good state of mind. He had no idea, we think, that the business was in such dire straits. He had no reason to die.
There's no way that David, in his right mind, would do a suicide pact because he loved life too much and he was enjoying it too much. You know, the weeks before he got killed, he was down with us, enjoying it, planning the next year, the next trips, where we were going. He would never had that in his back of his mind. So we knew for ourselves then that she was bonkers and she had done it and she was now trying to get herself out of a murder.
Suddenly, here we are. It's now a suicide pact. And who has a suicide pact but's locked behind a door that they don't have the key to, so they couldn't even change their mind if they wanted to? Poor David died on his hands and knees in a praying position, leaning against a door that was locked from the outside. That's not a suicide pact.
With time running out to hold Julie Dixon without charge, Senior Investigating Officer Stuart Gibbon consults with the Crown Prosecution Service.
So we clearly were very concerned about this prepared statement and just felt that it was probably another way of shifting focus. You know, we've had the masked offenders, they no longer exist now, so now we're going to go down the suicide pact, which is, interestingly enough, is a partial defence to murder, and if found to be true, could result in a conviction for manslaughter rather than murder. So that kind of made sense at that point. We had CPS working with us, so we could talk to them about the content of that prepared statement. They were already fully au fait with the evidence that we gathered that far. And the CPS lawyer was happy at that point that there was sufficient evidence to provide a realistic prospect for conviction. So the decision was made to charge Julie Dixon with murdering her partner, David Twigg.
With Dixon charged with murder, police and CPS prepare for trial, and part of that means trying to establish a motive. Why would Julie want David dead?
The main strands of evidence, really, I mean, there were quite a few bits of circumstantial as well, the petrol and the redirection of the post, but the main ones were really the finances. You know, we found out that they were in dire straits. What I think is that it was getting to the point where a warrant was issued for non-payment of fines. The bailiffs were going to turn up at the workshop at some point. That is the stage where David would become aware of the scale of this debt, in fact the debt existed at all maybe, and Julie Dixon could then hold that back no longer. That was where it was all going to come to a head.
As well as discovering the couple were in serious financial trouble, police now had CCTV proving Julie purchased petrol on the day of the murder. But it's forensic evidence of a computer found in the couple's workshop, which really helps build the case for the prosecution.
We'd heard stories that she'd been Googling stuff on a laptop, claiming that David had been Googling stuff. How do you commit suicide with it being undetected?
She was Googling on her laptop how to poison someone with cakes and how to get away with murder.
As the trial approaches, Julie Dixon changes her story yet again.
Things kind of changed a little bit again when Julie Dixon then started to say that it wasn't a suicide pact. Actually, David did want to die, and she was just trying to help him along, basically. So she's trying to remove herself even further from any kind of blame whatsoever. You know, it was David's idea. David wanted to do it. I just kind of helped him. Things had changed hugely since the first 999 call to the emergency services, but we felt we had a strong case. On the second day of that hearing, the not guilty plea, which had been entered initially by Julie Dixon, changed to a guilty plea, but she still maintained at that point that this had been all about David wanting to die. That's what the defence was putting forward, whereas our defence was cold-blooded, premeditated, pre-planned murder.
With Julie's shocking confession, the trial is halted.
Once Julie Dixon had admitted her guilt and pleaded guilty to David's murder, the role of the jury was no longer needed, but then falls to the judge to decide on what basis he believes her plea and on what basis the killing was carried out. So this is what is called a Newton hearing, and the judge hears evidence from all the parties in the case, and it's in the judge's role to decide how the murder was carried out effectively.
The prosecution lays out its case to the judge, and Julie's 999 call is played to the court.
The attackers and set fire to the place.
So the place that actually set fire?
Yeah.
Is it the building that's on fire?
It is, yeah.
It is, okay then.
I got out. I managed to get
Right then. It's okay. Is everybody out of the building?
No, there's still my partner in.
The phone call, on the face of it, sounded very genuine. She sounded distraught. She was hysterical. But actually, the first information imparted was more of an account about what they'd been doing, like a rehearsal, rather than just saying, I need help and I need help quickly.
Over 5 days, the court hears how Julie's account changed throughout the investigation. From masked intruders to a joint suicide pact, to her assisting David in his own bid to take his own life.
The defence argued, once Julie Dixon had pleaded guilty, that matters had spiralled out of control and that in some ways this had been an emotional response from Julie Dixon, almost that she had panicked because of the financial difficulties she got into. However, I think from the prosecution's point of view, and certainly from the police point of view, this was a perpetrator who had changed her accounts whenever it had suited her, whenever she had been confronted with new evidence. There was always a line of defence. So it's hard not to see her really as a very skillful and manipulative liar.
Julie Dixon didn't take the stand at all, didn't give evidence, was again very impassive, didn't present any emotion at any stage of the court proceedings, merely sat in the dock and appeared to be listening to the proceedings.
The extent of the couple's financial difficulties is revealed to the judge.
David wouldn't have had a clue about that bankruptcy. He was quite happy going about his everyday business. I think if he had found out that he had been declared bankrupt, he would have been incredibly upset, being such a proud man. So, yeah, she obviously kept that from him. And I can't see that those finances would have been enough for anyone to lose their life over.
At the end of that hearing, Judge Heath had to decide whose account he believed. And he came firmly down on David Twigg's side and said that he in no way believed that David Twigg had wanted to commit suicide, and he described Julie Dixon's account as a pack of lies.
The judge was quite damning in his comments and quite clear that he thought it was a cold-blooded murder and that, you know, she'd been kind of playing the part, and it was potentially worthy of an Oscar nomination if it hadn't been so sad and so true.
Julie Dixon is sentenced to life with a minimum of 23 years for the murder of David Twigg. 11 years on, he is still remembered fondly.
No sentence can ever bring back a loved one. It will never be enough, of course, and it will never bring David back. But I just hope it brings some little comfort to the loved ones and those who loved David so much.
It just beggars belief that anyone would do that to another human being, a living person, someone you're supposed to care about, your partner. It's just incredibly difficult to understand how anyone would do that.
I think the hardest thing is to wrap your head around is the way she calculated it, how she planned it all. What else was she planning? What else was she thinking? They say it's down to money. We'll never know. Obviously, she don't care about anybody because obviously she did what she did. So no one will ever know what's going through her head.
This investigation and this case impacted hugely on the community and the village of Burla Marsh. You know, people aren't going to forget what happened. It lives with them forever, and whenever the name of the village is sometimes mentioned, people will talk about this case. I know I certainly will never forget it.
When a routine call to a house fire turns into the biggest murder investigation in Welsh history, you know you're in for a chilling ride. New Murder in the Valleys starts Wednesday at 9.
Am I really good enough for you? You're the one I want. I don't want to marry anyone else. My fiancée, Emily, said this with a smile. Moreover, Emily is a president's daughter. I, a single part-time employee in my 30s, was an unlikely match for her. My name is Michael. I've been dating Emily for 3 years. Our meeting was thanks to a high school classmate, David, who took me to a matchmaking party. It was a small gathering, held locally, with people from nearby areas participating. There, Emily, who had approached me while I was spacing out, talked to me. At the party, being a part-time employee, I got cold attitudes from the women who looked down on me. I've been working part-time to take care of my sick mother, but she's getting better, and now I'm aiming for a full-time position. I honestly shared, but the chilly gazes remained. Well, I guess it can't be helped. I was almost giving up when Emily showed a completely opposite attitude. Oh, you work in the deli section of a supermarket. Then you must be good at cooking. Well, I am good at making quiches. Quiches? I love quiche Lorraine. Unlike me, Emily was an office worker at a mid-sized company. She had a stable salary and was in her early 20s. So young. I couldn't understand why she approached someone like me. Because you looked as bored as me. She replied with a laugh when I asked. Then she asked me, Hey, which supermarket do you work at? I worked at a small, long-standing supermarket in this town. When I told her the name of the supermarket I worked at, she smiled contentedly and said, I've decided. I'm going to date you. What? I was surprised by her words. Of course, unless you don't like it. No, not at all. I'm the one who should say, thank you so much. That's how I started dating her. Sorry to ask again, but are you really sure about someone like me? When I asked for confirmation, she replied in a sulky manner, because I wanted to be with you, as we were in our 30s. Naturally, we thought about marriage. But Emily was still 24. She was more than 10 years younger than me, and from an outsider's perspective, she might have seemed to have chosen the wrong partner. I don't need a reason to like you, or is there something you're dissatisfied with? No, of course not. It's just that sometimes I wonder why me. There was another reason I hesitated about dating her. It was because she was a president's daughter. Moreover, to my surprise, the president of the company that owns the supermarket you work at is my father. She confessed this to me within a week of dating. That's why, when I met you at the matchmaking party, I felt there must be some connection with you, Emily said. I was speechless at her words. She had been encouraged to go on matchmaking dates before but never found anyone interesting, so she decided to go to a party with a friend. Yet, an office worker from a mid-sized company and a part-time supermarket employee like me. Even that was an unlikely match, let alone the fact that her family owned a business. You don't want to break up, do you? Just as I was about to say we were an unlikely match, she glared at me. While I was stunned, I apologized to her, looking down, saying, "No, it's not like that, sorry. Time flew by just like that, and it was only a few days ago that she said, "I think it's about time we start thinking about getting married." I said, "Of course, I've been thinking about it too," and she smiled, took something out of her bag, and held it out to me. "Here you go, an engagement ring. Isn't it usually the man who gives that?" When I told her my surprise, she said, "It's okay, isn't it? A woman can give it too." And that's how we became engaged. Now, I had to meet her parents. "Won't your parents oppose us?" "Don't worry. My dad isn't that kind of strict person." Okay, but still, a part-timer like me and you, it's like we're from different worlds. That doesn't matter. I want you. Hearing Emily say that, I fell silent. Right. My job now is to make Emily happy. It's the first time I've met someone who cares so much about me. I realized I had to cherish her. "Got it. I'll try my best to become the man worthy of you." I smiled and replied to her, "I don't know if your parents will like me, but I'll do my best." "Thank you." When we went to greet her parents, surprisingly, they accepted me smoothly. Her father, as I heard, was a son-in-law himself and had come from the countryside when he was young, struggling a lot. He had a tough time when he wanted to marry because her grandfather, who ran the supermarket, opposed it initially. Because of that, he thought that when his daughter brought home a marriage partner, he would approve unless there was a serious reason not to. I vowed to her parents to make her absolutely happy. Then we were busy preparing for the wedding, and before we knew it, the day arrived. At her request, we had a small wedding with close friends and colleagues at a restaurant we rented out. We had already greeted the family, so they didn't come. It was a casual party. I was nervous all morning and went to the venue. Little did I know that a terrible misfortune would strike on the wedding day. It happened right before the party started. My boss, Jack, suddenly came up to me and asked, "Hey, how did a guy like you manage to win over the boss's daughter? Did you do something shady?" "Jack, what are you talking about?" I was shocked by Jack's sudden comment. He was supposed to be happy for my wedding. I couldn't believe I was hearing such words. Everyone at work is gossiping. They say Michael must have used some dirty tricks to win the president's daughter's heart. Yeah, right. Like a part-timer could marry a president's daughter. Jack and other colleagues chuckled at me. People around started to glance over. A tense atmosphere surrounded us, and all I could do was bow my head and endure. "What's going on here?" Then, Emily's angry voice echoed. She stepped forward to defend me and continued, "Stop saying weird things, and I know. There was a time when he was supposed to be promoted to full-time, but you crushed it. You even deliberately put a foreign object in his quiches to create a complaint." "Emily, that was just my guess." As I tried to stop her, Jack blurted out, "Why does the lady know about that?" Then, frowning, he made a face as if realizing he had slipped up. I was stunned. There had been talks about my full-time promotion a few years ago. But a few days later, a complaint arose about a foreign object found in the quiches I was in charge of cooking. This led to the full-time employment opportunity being scrapped. At the time, when I heard about the contamination, I was pale-faced, and Jack said, "It's a shame the result turned out this way because you didn't make proper quiches. You'll need to write a report on this." I remember Jack had a brief smirk after saying that. I, having no recollection of such a mistake, confronted Jack. "Wait a minute, there's no way something could have gotten mixed in during the process. I always ensure everything is checked thoroughly. This has never happened before." "So what are you saying? Are you implying that the customer is lying?" "I've never said anything like that. I began to suspect Jack when I saw his smirking face. He was the one who had displayed those quiches in the store. But there was no proof. I couldn't think of any reason why Jack would do such a thing. Then, an unexpected person appeared before us. Seeing this person, Jack's eyes widened in fear. Mr. Thompson, Emily's father, the president of the supermarket, Mr. Thompson, glared at Jack and continued. I've been listening to the conversation. You just asked Emily. Why does the lady know about that? What do you mean by that? No. I was just wondering why she knew about Michael's complaint. Jack stammered his response. Michael and my daughter are in a relationship. They would discuss such things. The issue is why you reacted to that conversation. That is, Jack slumped, weakened by Mr. Thompson's words. Then, suddenly, he apologized to me. I'm sorry. I thought if you became a full-time employee, my position would be at risk. Why would that be the case? That is, Jack fumbled for words at my question. Let's discuss this in another room. Yes. Mr. Thompson said this and walked away with Jack. As they left the venue, we looked at each other. Why did Jack do such a thing? I was consumed by these thoughts until the ceremony ended. Mr. Thompson later revealed that Jack was worried that if I, a diligent worker, became full-time, I would quickly surpass